Chapter 31 of A Ball Player's Career. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Cavaet. A Ball Player's Career by Adrian C. Anson. Chapter 31. Home, Sweet Home. Our voyage back to God's country, by which term of endearment the American travelling abroad often refers to the United States, was by no means a pleasant one, as we encountered heavy weather from the start, the Adriatic running into a storm immediately after leaving Queenstown that lasted 2 days and 2 nights, during which time we made but slow progress, and as a result there were a good many vacant seats at the table when meal times came. A storm at sea is always an inspiring sight, and it was a pleasure to those of us who were lucky enough to have our sea legs on to watch the big ship bury her nose in the mountainous waves, scattering the spray in great clouds, and then rising again as buoyantly as the proverbial cork. The decks were not a pleasant point of vantage, however, even for the most enthusiastic admirer of nature, as a big wave would now and then break over the forward part of the vessel, drenching everything and everybody within reach, making the decks as slippery as a well-waxed ballroom. I had quit smoking some time before starting on this trip, and was therefore deprived of blowing a cloud with which to drive dull care away during the tedious days that followed. Like the rest of the party, too, once started, I was impatient to reach home again, and for that reason the slow progress that we made the first few days was not greatly to my liking. The weather moderated at the end of 48 hours, and though the waves still wore their nightcaps and were too playful to go to bed, they occasioned us but little annoyance, and we bowled along over the Atlantic in merry fashion, killing time by spinning yards, playing poker, and taking a turn at the roulette wheel which Fred Carroll had purchased at Nice to remind him of his experience at Monte Carlo. At a very early hour on Saturday morning, April 6th, we were far off Fire Island, and sunrise found us opposite Quarantine. Our baseball friends in New York, who had been looking for us for 3 days, had been early apprised that the Adriatic had arrived off Sandy Hook, and, boarding the little steamer Starin and the tug George Wood, they came down the bay 200 strong to meet us. With the aid of a Liedel Sherman band, steam whistles, and lusty throats, they made noise enough to bring us all on deck in a hurry. As the distance between the vessels grew shorter, we could distinguish among others the faces of Marcus Mayer, W. W. Kelly, John W. Russell, Digby Bell, DeWolf Hopper, Colonel W. T. Coleman, and many others, not least among them being my old father, who had come on from Marshalltown to be among the first to welcome myself and my wife back to America, and who, as soon as the Starin was made fast, climbed on deck and gave us both a hug that would have done credit to the muscular energy of a grizzly bear, but who was no happier to see us than we were to see him, and to learn that all was well with our dear ones. I'm not sure, but the next thing that he did was to propose a game of poker to some of the boys, but if he did not, it was simply because there was too much excitement going on. That evening we were the guests of Colonel McCall at Palmer's Theatre, where DeWolf, Hopper, Digby Bell, and other prominent comic opera stars were playing in The May Queen. The boxes that we occupied that night were handsomely decorated with flags and bunting, while from the proscenium arch hung an emblem of all nations, a gilt eagle and shield with crossed bats and a pair of catcher's gloves and a catcher's mask. Every allusion to the trip and to the members of the teams brought out the applause, and by, the crowd began to call for speeches from Ward and myself, but Ward wouldn't, and I couldn't, and so the comedians on the stage were left to do all of the entertaining. The next day, Sunday, was spent quietly in visiting among our friends, and Monday we played the first game after our return on the Brooklyn grounds. The day was damp and cold, and for that reason the crowd was comparatively a small one, there being only 4,000 people on hand to give us a welcome. But these made up in noise where they lacked in numbers, and yelled themselves hoarse as we marched onto the grounds. Once again, after a hard-fought contest, we were beaten by a single run, All-America 7, Chicago 6 being the score. At night we were given a banquet at Delmonico's by the New York admirers of the game, and it was a notable gathering of distinguished men that assembled there to do us honour, among them being A.G. Mills, ex-president of the National League, who acted as chairman, the Honourable Chauncey M. Depew, Honourable Daniel Doughty, Henry E. Howland, W. H. McElroy, U.S. Consul G.W. Griffin, who was representing the United States at Sydney when we were there, Mayor Chapin of Brooklyn, Mayor Cleveland of Jersey City, Erastus Wyman, Samuel L. Clements, Mark Twain, and the Reverend Joseph Twitchell of Hartford, Connecticut, while scattered about the hall at various tables were seated representatives of different college classes, members of the New York Stock Exchange, the president and prominent members of the New York Athletic Club, and other crack athletic organizations of New York and vicinity, while in the gallery the ladies had been seated, presumably for the purpose of seeing that we neither ate nor drank too much during the festivities. Mr. Mills in his address reminded his hearers of the occasion that had brought them together, and pronounced a glowing eulogy upon the game and its beauties, and upon the players that had journeyed around the world to introduce it in foreign climes, and then called upon Mayor Cleveland of New Jersey, whose witty remarks excited constant laughter, and who wound up by welcoming us home in the name of the 20,000 residents of the little city across the river. Mayor Alfred Chapin of Brooklyn followed in a brief and laughter-provoking address, after which Chauncey M. Depew arose amid enthusiastic cheering and spoke as follows. Representing, as I do, probably more than any other human being, the whole of the American people who were deprived, by a convention that did not understand its duty, of putting me where I belong, and representing, as I do, by birth and opportunity, all the nationalities of the globe, I feel that I have been properly selected to give you the welcome of the world. I am just now arranging and preparing a centennial oration, which I hope may, and fear may not, meet all the possibilities of the 30th of April, in presenting the majesty of that which created the government, which we boast of, and of the land and country of which we are proud, but I feel that that oration is of no importance compared with the event of this evening. Washington never saw a baseball game. Madison wrote the Constitution of the United States and died without seeing one. Jefferson was the author of the Declaration of Independence, and yet his monument has no tribute of this kind upon it. Hamilton, the most marvellous and creative genius, made constitutions, built up systems, and created institutions, and yet never witnessed a baseball game. I feel as I stand here that all the men that have ever lived and achieved success in this world have died in vain. I am competent to pay that tribute, because I never played a game in my life, and I never saw it but once, and then did not understand it. A philosopher whom I always read with interest, because his abstractions sometimes approach the truth, wrote an article of some acumen several years ago, in which he said that you could mark the march of civilization and rise of liberty and its decadence by the interest which the nations took in pugilism. The nations of the earth which submit to the most grinding of despotisms have no pugilists. The nations of Europe, which have never risen in their boasted establishments to a full comprehension of republicanism, have no pugilists. While Ireland and the Irish people, who can never be crushed, who have poetry, song, and eloquence that belong to genius, have the most remarkable pugilists. England, which has a literature which is the only classic of today, which has an aristocracy and a form of government which is nearly democratic, has remarkable pugilists, and when you reach the seal of culture in America, Boston, you find the prince of pugilists. Now, that philosopher was right in general principle, but wrong in the game. Civilization is marked, and has always been marked in all ages, by an interest in the manly arts. In conclusion, Mr. Depew eulogized the returning tourists and ended with a brilliant panegyric in favour of the national game. In responding to the toast, the influence of manly sports, the Honourable Daniel Doherty made a brilliant address in favour of outdoor games, after which President Spaulding paid a compliment to the excellent conduct and ball-playing abilities of the two teams, and Captain Ward and myself made the briefest of remarks. Chairman Mills then introduced Mark Twain, speaking of him as a native of the Sandwich Islands, which brought out the following address. Though not a native as intimated by the chairman, I have visited the Sandwich Islands, that peaceful land, that beautiful land, that far-off home of profound repose and soft indolence and dreamy solitude, where life is one long slumberous Sabbath, the climate one long delicious summer day, and the good that die experience no change, for they but fall asleep in one heaven and wake up in another. And these boys have played baseball there. baseball, which is the very symbol, the outward and visible expression of the drive and push and rush and struggle of the raging, tearing, booming 19th century. One cannot realize it. The place and the fact are so incongruous. It's like interrupting a funeral with a circus. Why, there is no legitimate point of contact, no possible kinship between baseball and the Sandwich Islands. Baseball is all fact. The islands are all sentiment. In baseball, you've got to do everything just right, or you don't get there. In the islands, you've got to do everything all wrong, or you can't stay there. You do it wrong to get it right, for if you do it right, you get it wrong. There isn't any way to get it right, but to do it wrong, and the wronger you do it, the righter it is. The natives illustrate this every day. They never mount a horse from the larboard side. They always mount him from the starboard. On the other hand, they never milk a cow on the starboard side. They always milk her on the larboard. It's why you see so many short people there. They've got their heads kicked off. When they meet on the road, they don't turn to the right, they turn to the left. And so, from always doing everything wrong end first, it makes them left-handed and cross-eyed. They are all so. In those islands, the cats haven't any tails, and the snakes haven't any teeth. And, what is still more irregular, the man that loses a game gets the pot. As to dress, the women all wear a single garment, but the men don't. No, the men don't wear anything at all. They hate display. When they wear a smile, they think they are overdressed. Speaking of birds, the only bird there has ornamental feathers, has only two, just only enough to squeeze through with, and they are under its wings instead of on the top of its head, where, of course, they ought to be to do any good. The natives' language is soft and liquid and flexible, and in every way efficient and satisfactory, till you get mad, and then, there you are, there isn't anything in it to swear with. Good judges all say it is the best Sunday language there is, but then all the other 6 days of the week it just hangs idle on your hands. It isn't any good for business, and you can't work a telephone with it. Many a time the attention of the missionaries has been called to this defect, and they are always promising they are going to fix it. But no, they go fooling along, and nothing is done. Speaking of education, everybody there is educated from the highest to the lowest. In fact, it's the only country in the world where education is actually universal. And yet, every now and then you run across instances of ignorance that are simply revolting to the human race. Think of it. There the 10 takes the ace, but let us not dwell on such things. They make a person ashamed. Well, the missionaries are always going to fix that, but they put it off, and put it off, and put it off, and so that nation is going to keep on going down and down until some day you'll see a pair of jacks beat a straight flush. Well, it is the refreshment to the jaded, water to the thirsty, to look upon men who have been so lately breathed the soft air of these isles of the blessed, and had before their eyes the inextinguishable vision of their beauty. No alien land in all the world has any deep, strong charm for me but that one. No other land could look so longingly and beseechingly tempt me, sleeping and waking through half a lifetime, as that one has done. Other things leave me, but that abides. Other things change, but that remains the same. For me, its balmy airs are always blowing, its summer seas flashing in the sun. The pulsing of its surf beat is in my ears. I can see its garlanded crags, its leaping cascades, its plumy palms drowsing by the shore, its remote summits floating like islands above the cloud rack. I can hear the spirits of the woodland solitudes. I can hear the splash of its brooks. In my nostrils still lives the breath of the flowers that perished 20 years ago. And these world wanderers that sit before me here have lately looked upon these things, and with the eyes of the flesh, not the unsatisfying vision of the spirit. I envy them that. Mark Twain may have been better than he was that night, but if so, I should like someone to mention the time and place. To be sure, he made a mistake in taking it for granted that we had played ball there, but then it was not our fault that we had not. It was all the fault of the horrid blue laws that prevented us from making an honest dollar. Digby Bell and DeWolf Hopper gave recitations in response to the loud demand made for them, and it was not until long after midnight that an adjournment was finally made. The next day we played our second game in Brooklyn before a crowd of 3,500, and gave a rather uninteresting exhibition, the Chicago's taking the lead at the start and holding it to the finish, the All-Americas supporting Crane in a very slipshod manner. That same evening, as we left for Baltimore, where 6,000 people gave us a hearty welcome when we appeared, the next afternoon on the association grounds. Here we put up a good game, the Chicago's winning by a score of 5-2. We arrived in Philadelphia the next morning at 11 o'clock and found a committee composed of the officers of the Philadelphia clubs and representatives of the Philadelphia papers at the depot awaiting our arrival. Entering carriages, we were driven down Chestnut Street to Southside Ferry, where we took the boat for Gloucester and were given a planked shad dinner at Thompson's. Returning, we were driven directly to the grounds of the Athletic Club, where the Athletics and Bostons were playing an exhibition game. When our party filed into the grounds at the end of the third inning, play was suspended, and as the band played Home Again, we were given a great ovation. At the conclusion of the game, which we witnessed from a section of the grandstand that had been reserved for us, we went to the Continental Hotel, and then, after we had donned evening dress, we were escorted to the Hotel Bellevue, where we had been tendered a banquet by the Philadelphia Sporting Life. The banquet hall on this occasion was beautifully decorated, and as we entered, the band played The Day I Played Baseball. Frank C. Richer occupied the chairman's seat, others at the same table being A.G. Spaulding, Colonel A.K. McClure of the Philadelphia Times, Colonel M.R. Muckle of the Ledger, John I. Rogers, Harry Wright, A.G. Reach, Captain John M. Ward, C.H. Byrne of the Brooklyn Club, President W.M. Smith of the City Council, Thomas Dando, President of the Sporting Life Company, and myself. There were over 300 guests in all, and it was late before the speech-making began. After a brief welcoming address by Chairman Richter, Mr. Dando and President Smith, there were loud calls for Mr. Spaulding, who gave a brief outline of our experiences in foreign lands. Captain Ward and myself responded in behalf of our respective teams, and I took the occasion to pay the boys all a compliment that I thought that they had deserved, because each and every member had behaved himself as a gentleman. Speeches by Colonel Rogers and C.H. Byrne followed, after which came a glowing tribute to the national game from the lips of Colonel McClure, followed by an interesting sketch of the game and its growth in popular favour by Henry Chadwick, who has the history of the game from its first inception down to the present time at his finger-ends. A.J. Reach, Harry Wright, Tim McNain, Lee Lynch and the irrepressible Fogarty all took their turn at amusing the party, and again it was a late hour, or rather an early one, when we returned to our quarters. The next afternoon we were accorded a reception by Mayor Fitler in his office, who, in shaking hands with the tourists, gave us all the heartiest of the sort of welcome. That afternoon we played on the grounds of the Philadelphias to a crowd of 4,000 people, the weather being threatening. This proved to be a close and exciting contest, Chicago winning by a score of 6-4, Tenor and Healy both being in fine shape. The next day found us in Boston, where we played to 4,000 people, and where the contest proved to be a one-sided affair, a brilliant double play by Duffy, Tenor and myself, and a quick double play by Manning and Wise being the redeeming features. It was something of a picnic for the All-Americas, as they won by a score of 10-3. The following evening we started on a trip to Chicago, stopping at Washington en route. Here we were notified of President Harrison's wish to receive the party, and, visiting the White House, we were introduced to Benjamin Harrison, whose reception was about as warm as that of an icicle, and who had succeeded in making us all feel exceedingly uncomfortable. That afternoon 3,000 people saw us wipe the ground with the All-Americas, upon which the President's reception had had a bad effect, as the score, 18-6, indicates. The next day we played at Pittsburgh to a crowd of the same size, the score being a tie, each team having made 3 runs at the end of the 9th inning. The day following at Cleveland, 4,500 people saw us win by a score of 7-4. At Indianapolis, the All-Americas took their revenge, however, beating us in the presence of 2,000 people by a score of 9-5. Friday noon we left the Hoosier capital for Chicago in a special car over the Monon route, and at Hammond, where we had already gotten into dress suits, we were met by a crowd of Chicagoans who had told us that Chicago was prepared to give us the greatest reception that we had yet had, a fact that proved to be only too true. The crowd at the depot was a howling, yelling mob, and as we entered our carriages and the procession moved up Wabash Avenue and across Harmon Court to Michigan Avenue, amid the bursting of rockets, the glare of calcium lights and Roman candles, we felt that we were indeed at home again. It seemed as if every amateur baseball club in the city had turned out on this occasion, and as they passed us in review, the gay uniforms and coloured lights made the scene a very pretty one. At the Palmer House, the crowd was fully as large as that which had greeted us at the depot. The reception committee, embracing Judge H. M. Shepherd, Judge H. N. Hibbard, Potter Palmer, John R. Walsh, Frederick Ullman, L. G. Fisher, D. K. Hill, C. L. Willoughby, C. E. Rawlings, F. M. Lester, J. B. Kitchen, J. B. Knight, M. A. Fields, Dr. Hathaway, L. M. Hamburger, Louis Manasse, and C. F. Gunther. The banquet given in our honour that night was a most elegant affair, among those seated at the speaker's table being Mayor DeWitt C. Crager, Honourable Carter H. Harrison, Reverend Dr. Thomas James W. Scott, President of the Chicago Press Club, A. G. Spaulding, G. W. Driggs, and others. It was after 10 o'clock when Mayor Krieger called the banqueteers to order and made a speech of welcome, to which Mr. Spaulding replied. The Reverend Dr. Thomas responded to the toast of baseball as a national amusement, and myself to His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales. But the boys kept up such a constant cheering while I was on my feet that I am afraid they did not appreciate all the good things I said in regard to England's future ruler. The national value of athletics brought out a stirring address from Major Henry Turner, and John M. Ward expressed himself most happily on "The World as I Found It." Ex-Mayor Carter H. Harrison responded to the toast, "My Own Experience," and compared in humorous fashion his own trip around the world with the one that we had just completed. Other toasts responded to by various members of the party. We adjourned. The next afternoon we played the last game of the trip at the West Side Park, and were beaten by a score of 22-9, the All-Americas falling upon Baldwin and batting him all over the grounds. The next day the tourists went their several ways, and so ended a tour such as had never before been planned, and that cost me in round figures about $1,500, that being my share of the losses incurred in advertising, the sporting goods business of the Spauldings, their businesses being greatly benefited by the tour, and how they repaid me afterwards. Well, that's another story. End of Chapter 31. Chapter 32 of A Ball Player's Career. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Cavaet. A Ball Player's Career by Adrian C. Anson. Chapter 32. The Revolt of the Brotherhood. The playing strength of the league teams of 1889 was remarkably even. That is to say, on paper. Detroit had dropped out and Cleveland had taken its place in the ranks. 4 of the old Detroit players going to Boston, 1 to Philadelphia, 3 to Pittsburgh, and the balance to Cleveland. The Boston club had been the greatest gainer by the deal, however, and the majority of the fans looked for it to carry off the pennant. Once more the unexpected happened, however, and though it took the games of the very last day of the season to settle the standing of the first 6 clubs, the pennant finally went to New York for the second time, they winning 83 games and losing 43, while Boston came next with the same number of games won and 45 lost, and Chicago stood third with 65 games won and 65 lost, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Indianapolis, and Washington following in the order named. The Chicago team of that year consisted of Tenner, Dwyer, Hutchinson, and Gumbert, pitchers, Farrell, Darling, Summers, and Flint, catchers, Pfeffer, Burns, Bastian, Williamson, and myself in the infield, and Van Hultren, Ryan, and Duffy, outfielders. I was the manager and captain. It was not until late in the season that Williamson sufficiently recovered from the injury that he had received at Paris to join us, and his absence hurt our chances very materially, as the old stone wall infield was left in a crippled condition. That fall, the Brotherhood revolt that robbed the league of many of its best players took place, and though the reasons for this have been variously stated, yet I am of the opinion that it could all be summed up by one word: greed. For that was certainly the cornerstone of the entire structure. It has also been said that the plan of the Brotherhood was perfected by the ringleaders therein during the around-the-world trip, and it may be that this is true, but if such was the case, the whole affair was kept remarkably quiet, for it was not until away late in the season that I was aware of the intended secession of the players, I then being approached by John M. Ward with a proposal to join them, a proposal that I declined with thanks, giving as my reason that the league had always treated me fairly and honestly up to that time, and that such being the case I could see no reason why I should leave them in an underhand manner. The truth of the matter is that I felt bound in honour to stand by my friends, even if I sank with them, and at that time the skies did look remarkably dark, and it was a question in my mind as to what would be the outcome. The fact that the majority of the league clubs had the season before made a great deal of money excited the cupidity of certain capitalists, and they, finding the players dissatisfied over some minor grievances, incited them to revolt, hoping to use them as catspaws with which to pull the financial chestnuts out of the fire. The Brotherhood was a secret organisation, and one that was originally formed by the promoters with their object of protecting the ball players and their rights, and not for the purpose of disrupting the old league and forming a new one in opposition, as it afterwards attempted to do. It first made itself felt in the fall of 1887, when it compelled the league to draw up a new form of contract, in which the rights of the players were better understood than under the form that had been previously used. When the new contract was adopted, the full amount of each player's salary could not be written therein because of the national agreement, which contained a 2,000 salary limit clause, and, as the American Association clubs could not allow this to be stricken out, the players were greatly displeased, they having to sign contracts at $2,000 and make outside contracts for all compensation over that amount that they received. Threats as to what the Brotherhood would do were freely made at the time, but nothing came of them. At the annual meeting in 1888, the Indianapolis, Pittsburgh, and Washington clubs demanded of the league a scheme that would limit players' salaries, which had grown to enormous proportions, and the result was that a classification rule which divided the players into 5 classes as follows: Class A to receive $2,500, Class B $2,250, Class C $2,000, Class D $1,750, and Class E $1,500. It being agreed among the clubs, however, that this classification should not apply to players with whom they then had agreements, or to players with whom they should make agreements, or to whom they felt under moral obligations to do so, previous to December 15, 1888. It was also provided that the players then absent on the world's trip should be accorded 2 weeks after their return in which to arrange matters before they should be subject to classification. We were abroad at that time, but the players at home remonstrated strongly against the classification, claiming that in a few years it would have a tendency to lower the salaries very materially. But in the absence of John M. Ward, who was the Brotherhood's leader, prevented any official action by the organisation. When Mr. Ward reached home again, contracts had been signed and nothing could be done, though it is now known that he favoured a strike at that time, but was outvoted by the cooler-headed members of the order. In the meantime, the New Yorks had agreed to release the Brotherhood leader to Washington for the sum of $12,000, the largest sum ever offered for the release of a player, but Ward's flat-footed refusal to play in the national capital team caused the deal to fall through. In the meantime, the discontented players had appointed a committee to present their grievances to the league, and President Young appointed a league committee to hear the players, of which committee A.G. Spaulding was chairman, but when an immediate hearing was asked for by Mr. Ward, Mr. Spaulding declined to meet the Brotherhood players until fall. This, according to the players' story, was the last straw that broke the camel's back, and from that time on they began, but with the greatest secrecy, to arrange their plans for secession. Having ascertained what was going on in the meantime, I used what influence I possessed in trying to persuade such of my players as was possible from taking what I then regarded as a foolish step, and though I managed to find some of them that would listen to me, there were others who would not, Pfeffer, Tenner, and Williamson being among the number, though they made no move openly towards desertion till after the playing season was over. On the 4th day of November, 1899, the Brotherhood met at the Fifth Avenue Hotel and threw off the mask, issuing the following address to the public. At last, the Brotherhood of Baseball Players feels at liberty to make known its intentions and defend itself against the aspersions and misrepresentations which for weeks it has been forced to suffer in silence. It is no longer a secret that the players of the league have determined to play next season under different management, but for reasons which will, we think, be understood, it was deemed advisable to make no announcement of this intention until the close of the present season. But now that the struggle for the various pennants is over, and the terms of our contracts expired, there is no longer reason for withholding it. In taking this step, we feel that we owe it to the public and to ourselves to explain briefly some of the reasons by which we have been moved. There was a time when the League stood for integrity and fair dealing. Today it stands for dollars and cents. Once it looked to the elevation of the game and an honest exhibition of the sport. Today its eyes are upon the turnstile. Men have come into the business for no other motive than to exploit it for every dollar in sight, Measures originally intended for the good of the game have been turned into instruments for wrong. The reserve rule and the provisions of the national agreement gave the managers unlimited power, and they have not hesitated to use this in the most arbitrary and mercenary way. Players have been bought, sold, and exchanged as though they were sheep instead of American citizens. Reservation became, with them, another name for property rights in the player. By the combination among themselves, stronger than the strongest trusts, they have been able to enforce the most arbitrary measures, and the player had either to submit or to get out of the profession, in which he had spent years in attaining proficiency. Even the disbandment and the retirement of a club did not free the players from the octopus clutch, for they were then peddled around to the highest bidder. That the players sometimes profited by the sale has nothing to do with the case, but only proves the injustice of the previous restraint. 2 years ago we met the League and attempted to remedy some of these evils, but through what has been called League diplomacy we completely failed. Unwilling longer to submit to such treatment, we made a strong effort last spring to reach an understanding with the League. To our application for a hearing they replied that the matter was not of sufficient importance to warrant a meeting, and suggested we put it off until fall. Our committee replied that the players felt that the League had broken faith with them, that while the results might be of little importance to the managers, they were of great importance to the players. That if the League would not concede what was fair, we would adopt other measures to protect ourselves. That if postponed until fall we would be separated and at the mercy of the League, and that, as the only course left to us required time and labour to develop, we must therefore insist upon an immediate conference. Then, upon their final refusal to meet us, we began organising for ourselves, and in shape to go ahead next year under new management and new auspices. We believe it possible to conduct our national game upon lines which will not infringe upon individual and natural rights. We ask to be judged solely by our work, and believing that the game can be played more fairly and its business conducted more intelligently under a plan which excludes everything arbitrary and un-American. We look forward with confidence to the support of the public and the future of the national game. Signed, the National Brotherhood of Ball Players. The Players' League, as finally organized, embraced the cities of Boston, Brooklyn, New York, and Philadelphia in the east, Buffalo, Chicago, Cleveland, and Pittsburgh in the west. According to the articles under which the League was formed, its government rested in a central board composed of its president and 2 directors, one a player and one a capitalist from each club. Any player who was dissatisfied with his location could apply to the board to be transferred without the payment of anything to the club, losing his services. All contracts would be made for 3 years, and no player could be released until after the first year had expired, and not then if he had kept his agreements and was still able and willing to play good ball. Severe penalties were provided for drunkenness, crookedness, and all profits from ground privileges, such as refreshments, scorecards, cigars, etc., belonged to the individual club. It also provided that all players were to have the same salaries that they had had in 1889, save such as had been cut down by the classification system, and they were to be paid the same salaries as in 1888, the same to be increased at the option of the club engaging them. This looked on paper to be a great scheme. But what it lacked was business brains in its management, and, as a result, its career was short and stormy, it being war to the knife and the knife to the hilt between the 2 great rival organizations. After 4 courts had decided the players had a right to leave the National League, each of the clubs located in the Players' League signed a compact to play that organization for 10 years. The National League then formed a schedule of playing dates that conflicted with the Players' League all through the season of 1890, this action throwing both clubs and public into confusion. The latter became so disgusted over the war of the rival factions as to stay away from the games altogether. At the end of the season, the Players' League bought the Cincinnati club, and as the Pittsburgh club was all but defunct, this left the National League with but 6 clubs. At the close of the championship season, a conference was held and plans agreed upon for ending the war, which had been financially disastrous to both parties. Committees were appointed by both leagues and by the American Association, having this end in view, but the Players' League, at a special meeting, added 3 professional players to its committee, and the National League refused to join in the conference. Secret meetings between the capitalists of the Players' League and the National League were held, with the result that the rival clubs in New York, Pittsburgh, and Chicago were consolidated, this causing the disruption of the Brotherhood. Looked at from a financial standpoint, the contrast between the seasons of 1889 and 1890 was a great one. The year 1889 was the most successful that the League had ever known, and the money fairly poured in at the gate. The year 1890, on the contrary, was one of the most disastrous the league had ever known, and on many occasions the clubs found themselves playing to almost empty benches. The defection of Tenner, Williamson, Ryan, Pfeffer and others left me with a comparatively green team on my hands when the season of 1890 opened, but long before the season came to a close, constant practice had made it one of the best teams in the league, as it proved by finishing in the second place. Few people, however, appreciate the amount of work that it was necessary to attain that result. It was hard work and plenty of it, and though some of the players objected to the amount of practice forced upon them and the strict discipline that was enforced, yet they had to put up with it, as that was the only manner in which the necessary playing strength could be developed. I myself worked just as hard as they did. If we took a 3-mile run, I was at their head setting the pace for them. I have never asked the men under my control to do anything that I was not willing to do myself, because it was just as necessary for me to be in good condition as it was for them. The Chicagos of 1890 were made up as follows: Hutchinson, Luby and Stein pitchers, Nagel and Kittredge catchers, Anson first base, Glenalvin second base, Burns third base, Cooney shortstop, Carroll left field, Andrews right field, and O'Brien, Earl and Foster substitutes. It will thus be seen that I had but one of the old reliables left, that being Burns, who had refused to affiliate with the Brotherhood, and who was to receive his reward later at the hands of the Chicago club management. The rest of the team was composed of a lot of half-broken colts, many of whom were newcomers in the league, and with a reputation yet to make, Hutchinson, Cooney and Wilmot being the pick of the bunch. There was never a time during this season that we were worse than fifth, and on several occasions we were right up there in the front rank. When October arrived we were in third place, but during the short season that followed we passed Philadelphia and took second position. Brooklyn carried off the pennant with a total of 86 games won and 43 lost, while Chicago had 83 games won and 53 lost, Philadelphia being third with 78 games won and 53 lost, while Cincinnati, Boston, New York, Cleveland and Pittsburgh followed in that order. This was an achievement to be proud of, and with the downfall of the Brotherhood and the consolidation of some of the leading clubs, I naturally thought the Chicago team would be strengthened very materially, but such was not the case. I did not even get my old players back, those of them that continued in the profession being scattered far and wide among the other league clubs, while others retired from the arena altogether. As a result, it was a constant hustle on my part to secure new players, and I think I may easily say that the hardest years of my managerial experience were those that followed the revolt to the Brotherhood, continuing until my retirement from the Chicago Club at the close of 1897, at which time I was the owner of 130 shares of the club's stock, which from the time of Mr. Hart's connection with it has been worthless so far as I'm concerned. End of chapter 32. Chapter 33 of A Ball Player's Career. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Cavaet. A Ball Player's Career by Adrian C. Anson. Chapter 33. My Last Years on the Ball Field. The season of 1891 proved to be almost as disastrous when viewed from a financial standpoint, as was the season of 1890. Owing to the war for the possession of good players that broke out between the National League and the American Association, that was caused by a refusal on the part of the last-named organization to stick to the terms of the national agreement, the result being the boosting of player salaries away up into fancy figures. This state of affairs proved to be exceedingly costly for all concerned, as really good players were at that time exceedingly scarce and the demand for them constantly growing. The Chicago team for that season was again, up to a very great extent, an experimental one, made up at the beginning of the season of the following named players: Luby, Gumbert and Hutchinson, pitchers; Shrivner and Kittredge, catchers; Anson first base, Pfeffer second base, Burns third base, Darlin shortstop, Wilmot, Ryan and Carroll outfielders, Cooney substitute. This proved to be a strong organization, and one that would have landed the pennant had it not been for the fact that the jealousy of the old players in the East, engendered by the Brotherhood revolt, would not allow a team of youngsters, many of whom were newcomers in the league, to carry off the honors, and a conspiracy was entered into whereby New York lost enough games to Boston to give the Bean-Eaters the pennant and to relegate us at the very last moment into second place. We had made a whirlwind fight for the honors, however, and though we lost, no fault could be laid either at my door or at the doors of the players, as we had the pennant won had it not been for the games that were dropped by the Giants to the Boston club, in order that the honours might not be carried off by a colt team. Hutchinson, upon whom most of the pitching work devolved, was one of the best in the business. He was a graduate of Yale, a gentleman and a player who used his head as well as his hands when in the box. Gumbert and Luby were both fair, and the latter, had it not been for strong drink, might have made for himself a much greater reputation than he did. Darlin at short was a tower of strength for the team, being as agile as a cat, a sure catch, and an exceptionally strong batter, while the rest of the infield and the entire outfield was away above the average in playing strength. The race in 1891 was one of the closest in the history of the league. Opening the season in third place, we never occupied a lower position. But on the contrary, out of the 24 weeks that the season lasted, we held the first place for the race for all of 15 weeks and should have finished at the top of the column had it not been for the reasons already given, which were largely commented on at the time by lovers of the game throughout the country, and the newspapers from one end of the United States to the other. At the beginning of the closing week of the season's campaign, Chicago was in the van by a percentage of victories of 628 to Boston's 615, which was apparently a winning lead, and which would have been had not the New York organization made a present of its closing games to the Boston club, with the express purpose of throwing us down and keeping the pennant in the East. As it was, however, we finished head and head with the leaders, New York being third, Philadelphia fourth, Cleveland fifth, Brooklyn sixth, Cincinnati seventh, and Pittsburgh eighth. As an excuse for the queer showing made by the Giants in these Boston games, it has been alleged that the team was in poor condition when it left the metropolis for the hub to play this closing series, and that its true condition was kept a secret by the management. One writer going so far as to say that manager Ewing's brother John was at that time disabled by a sprained ankle, while Rusey was suffering from a bruised leg, and also that Whistler had been playing at first base so well that Ewing thought he could afford to give Connor a day or two off, all of which may have been true, though I am free to confess right now that I do not believe it. In February 1892, the American Association became a thing of the past, 4 of its leading clubs joining the National League, which now embraced 12 cities instead of 8, the circuit taking in Boston, Brooklyn, Louisville, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Cincinnati, New York, Philadelphia, Washington, Chicago, St. Louis, and Baltimore. The Chicago team of that season consisted of A. Gumbert, Hutchinson, Luby, Miller, Hollister, and Meegan, pitchers, Kittredge and Shriver, catchers, Anson, first base, Canavan and Decker, second base, Darlin and Parrott, third base, Darlin and Cooney, shortstop, Ryan, Duggan, Wilmot, and Decker in the outfield. The majority of these were green players, so compared with the season material of which some of the other league clubs boasted, it was only by switching them about from one position to another that it was possible to tell where they best fitted. Although I had signed 6 pitchers at the beginning of the season, there were but 3 of them that fulfilled my expectations, viz. Gumbert, Hutchinson, and Luby, and of these 3, Hutchinson did the lion's share of the work, pitching in no less than 70 of the 156 games that was played. The team was not an evenly balanced one, however, and though it boasted some of the individuals that were way above the average, yet it lacked the ability and practice to play as a team, and consequently finished the season in 7th place, Boston again carrying off the pennant with 102 games won and 48 lost, while Cleveland came second with 93 won and 56 lost. Brooklyn being third, Philadelphia fourth, Cincinnati fifth, Pittsburgh 6th, Chicago 7th, New York 8th, Louisville 9th, Washington 10th, St. Louis 11th, and Baltimore last. I remember one rather queer incident that occurred during that season, and while we were playing in Boston. Henry E. Dixie, the actor who was then playing a summer engagement at the Hub, had driven out to the grounds as usual in his buckboard with his pet bull terrier, Dago, in the seat beside him. Dixie always retained a seat in his rig and took up his place right back of the left field. Dixie had not been on the ground more than 20 minutes when Darlin swiped the ball for a 3-bagger. It was one of those long, low, hard drives and sailed about 10 feet over the left fielder's head and in a direct line for Dixie. He couldn't have gotten out of the way had he tried, but the fact was that he didn't see it coming, and the first he knew of it was when he heard a sharp yelp at his side and saw poor Dago tumbling off his seat between the wheels. The dog was dead when picked up, the ball having broken his neck. Between the yellow buckboard, the dead canine, the frightened horses, and Dixie's excitement, the whole field was in an uproar, and it was fully 10 minutes before we could get down to playing again. But Darlin, the cause of it all, didn't even see the affair, and scored on the death of Dago, his being the only genuine case of making a doggone run that has ever come under my observation. Sometime during the winter of 1892 I added Big Bill Lange, who has since become one of the stars of the league, and Irwin to my string of fielders, and cast about to strengthen the pitching department of the team as far as possible, Gummit and Luby having been released. Having this object in view, no less than 11 twirlers were signed, of whom all but 4 proved comparative failures, Hutchinson, McGill, and Malk having to do the greater part of the work in the box, the other 8 men, Shaw, Donnelly, Clawson, Abbey, Griffith, McGuinness, Huey, and F. Parrott, being called on but occasionally. Of this lot, Griffith was the most promising, and he afterwards turned out to be a star of the first magnitude. With these exceptions, the team was about the same as that of the season before. It proved to be as great a disappointment to me as it did to the ball-loving public. I am now free to confess. It was a team of great promise and poor performance, and no one could possibly have felt more disappointed than I did when the end of the season found us in 9th place, the lowest place the Chicago club had ever occupied in the pennant race since the formation of the league, we having won 56 games during the season while we lost 71, a showing that was bad enough to bring the tears to the eyes of an angel, let alone a team manager and captain. The Bostons, whose team worked far and away the best of any of the league clubs, again walked away with the championship, that club winning 127 games and losing 63. While Pittsburgh came second, having won 81 games and lost 48. Cleveland was third with 73 games won and 55 lost, while Philadelphia, New York, Cincinnati, Brooklyn, Baltimore, Chicago, St. Louis, Louisville, and Washington finished as named. When the season of 1894 opened, I was pretty well satisfied that my team of Colts would make a much better showing than they had done during the previous year. But again I was doomed to disappointment. The team, with the exception of the pitching department, which had been very materially strengthened, was about the same as that with which I had taken the field the previous year, and that there was good enough material in it with which to win the pennant I was certain. It managed to fool me, however, and fool me good and hard, as well as several others who thought themselves good judges, and that before the season was half over. We started out with 7 pitchers: Griffith, Stratton, Hutchinson, Abbey, Terry, McGill, and Camp. The last name pitched in but a single game, which proved to be quite enough. Our start was a bad one, in fact the worst that we'd ever made. We lost 8 out of the first 9 games that we played, and in the end of May saw one club between us and the tail end of the procession, that one being Washington. Until the month of August was reached, we were never nearer than 9th in the race. That month we climbed into 8th position, and there we hung until the finish came, leaving the Baltimore, New York, and Boston clubs to fight it out between them, which they did. The first named carrying off the prize, winning 89 games and losing 39, against 88 won and 44 lost for Boston. After which came Philadelphia, Brooklyn, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Chicago, St. Louis, Cincinnati, Washington, and Louisville. When the championship season of 1895 opened, the Chicago club had 10 pitchers at its command, viz. Griffith, Hutchinson, Thornton, Parker, Friend, Stratton, Terry, McFarland, Dolden, and Abbey, 3 catchers, Kittredge, Donahue, and Moran, while I played first base, Stewart second base, Everett third base, Darlin shortstop, and Wilmot, Lange, Ryan, and Decker the outfield. There were at least 7 good twirlers in the bunch, at the head of which stood Griffith and Hutchinson. Thornton, Parker, Friend, Terry, and Stratton were all better than the average when just right, and it was certainly not the fault of the pitchers if the team did not carry off the pennant honours. As late as September the 7th, and when the club was in 9th place, predictions were freely made to the effect the club would not finish in the first division. But this time the Croakers proved to be all wrong, for the team made a grand rally in the closing weeks of the season and finished in 4th place, a fact that some of the newspaper critics seem to have purposely lost sight of at the time of my enforced retirement, that being the same place they stood under Burns's management the first season. The Baltimores again won the championship, they having 87 games won and 46 lost to their credit, as against Cleveland's 84 and 46 lost. Philadelphia 78 won and 53 lost, and Chicago 72 won and 58 lost. Brooklyn, Boston, Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, New York, Washington, and Brooklyn, following in order. The Chicago team of 1896 was a somewhat mixed affair, change following change in rapid succession. Hutchinson had retired from the game, and the pitchers, 7 in number, were Griffith, Thornton, Briggs, Friend, Terry, Parker, and McFarland, Kittredge and Donahue as catchers, myself and Decker alternating at first base, Pfeffer and Truby doing the same thing at second, Everett and McCormick at third, Darlan playing shortstop, and Lange, Everett, Ryan, Decker and Flynn took care of the outfield. The most of the pitching this season devolved upon Griffith and Friend, while Parker and McFarland both proved failures. Neither Pfeffer nor Decker were themselves for a great part of the season, and yet, in spite of all, the team played good ball and finished in 5th place, the pennant going for the 3rd consecutive time to Baltimore, which won 80 games and lost 39, while Cleveland came second with 80 games won and 48 lost. Cincinnati third with 77 games won and 50 lost. Boston fourth with 74 games and 57 lost, and Chicago fifth with 71 games won and 57 lost. Pittsburgh, New York, Philadelphia, Washington, Brooklyn, St. Louis, and Louisville finishing as named. The team with which I started out in 1897 was certainly good enough to win the pennant with, or at least to finish right up there in the front rank, and that it failed to do either of these things can only be explained by the fact that underhanded work looked towards my downfall was indulged in by some of the players who were aided and abetted by President Hart, he refusing to enforce the fines levied by myself as manager, and in that way belittling my authority and making it impossible to enforce the discipline necessary to making the team a success. The ringleader in the business was Jimmy Ryan, between whom and the club president the most perfect understanding seemed to exist, and for this underhanded work Ryan was rewarded later by being made team captain, a position that he was too unpopular with the players to hold, though it is generally thought he was allowed to draw the salary as per agreement. The Chicago players for that season were Briggs, Callahan, Friend, Griffith and Thompson, pitchers, Kittredge and Donahue, catchers, Decker and myself, first base, Connor, Callahan and Pfeffer, second base, Everett and McCormick, third base, Darlan, McCormick and Callahan, shortstop, and Lang, Ryan, Decker and Thornton, outfielders. Pfeffer was the only weak spot, he being handicapped by illness, yet even he might have made a credible showing had he not been handicapped by some of his associates, and most unmercifully criticised by the newspapers, whose unwarrantable attacks have, in many cases, to my certain knowledge, driven good men out of the business. Lack of discipline and insubordination began to show from the start. Fines were remitted in spite of all the protests that I could make, several members of the club being allowed to do about as they pleased. There could be but one result, as a matter of course, and that was poor ball playing. When the April campaign ended, we were in 11th place. At the end of May, we stood 10th. At the end of June, we were again dropped back to 11th. At the end of July, we had climbed up to 8th, and at the end of August, we were 6th, having then climbed into the 1st Division. When the close of the season came, however, we had dropped back again to the 9th position, the margin between 6th and 9th places being a very small one. The race for the pennant that season between Baltimore and Boston was a close one, the latter club finally carrying off the honours of the season with 93 games won and 39 lost, while Baltimore came second with 90 games won and 40 lost, and New York came third with 83 games won and 48 lost, Cincinnati being 4th, Cleveland 5th, Brooklyn 6th, Washington 7th, Pittsburgh 8th, Chicago 9th, Philadelphia 10th, Louisville 11th, and St. Louis 12th. Late that fall, newspapers began to publish articles to the effect that I was to be released by the Chicago League Ball Club, but as no official notice to that effect had been served on me, as I was conscious of always having done my duty by the organization which I was a stockholder, I for some time paid no attention to the matter. From mere rumours, however, these newspaper articles soon began to take on a more definite form, to be coupled with references to my management of the team that were, to say the least, both uncalled for and venomous. But still I heard nothing from headquarters that would lead me to suppose there was any truth in them. On the contrary, I was treated with the greatest consideration, Mr. Spaulding even going so far as to insist upon my attending the league meeting in my official capacity, where I made trades for players that were afterwards blocked by himself and President Hart, this action making my position a most humiliating one. Still ignorant of the fact that I was to be dropped from the club's rolls, and that without warning, after my long and faithful service, and Mr. Spaulding's solicitation that spring, I accompanied him on a trip to England, and while we were there he advised me not to worry about the club matters or the rumours that I had heard, as the thing would doubtless be all fixed up before our return. I then made a proposition to him that he and I should together buy the Chicago League Ball Club, a proposition that he partially acceded to, though in the view of subsequent events I am now certain that such a plan was not in reality entertained by him for a moment. Matters had indeed been fixed up on my return, and Tom Burns, my old third baseman, had been brought on from Springfield, Massachusetts, to manage the team, or rather to serve as a figurehead for the club's president. It was then that I was advised by Mr. Spaulding to resign, which I refused to do, preferring to take my medicine like a man, bitter as the dose might be. Mr. Burns that spring took up the reins that had been taken out of my hands, and how well he succeeded with the able assistance of the President Hart is now a matter of history. End of chapter 33. Chapter 34 of A Ball Player's Career. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Cavaet. A Ball Player's Career by Adrian C. Anson. Chapter 34. If this be treason, make the most of it. Experience is a mighty teacher. This is a fact that has been generally admitted by the world at large, but one that I never fully realized until within the last few years, though just how much it has cost me in the matter of dollars and cents, it is hard to say. It is but natural, I presume, after 22 years' connection with a corporation, for one to have well-defined opinions of certain of its officials, and it's pleasant to record here that prior to the advent of James A. Hart on the scene, my relations with the club were most pleasant. Under the watchful eye of Mr. Hurlbut, the club flourished, and not only maintained a higher average in the percentage column than it has since enjoyed, but in contradistinction to the latter-day methods of management, it annually returned a large balance on the right side of the ledger, this last feature being by no means the least pleasant of my memories. Now the query arises, if the team was so uniformly successful under Mr. Hurlbut, why has it not enjoyed the same measure of success since? And the answer, short and sweet, can be summed up in one word: mismanagement. As I have already explained elsewhere, my financial relations with Mr. Spaulding in regard to the around-the-world trip of the ball players, it is unnecessary for me to go again into that phase of the matter. But there was one little incident connected with that event that has not been told, and that accounts for Mr. Hart's desire to get rid of me as easily and as quietly as possible, even if he had to use underhanded measures in order to do so. When we started off our trip in 1888, it was found necessary to get someone to check the receipts of the various exhibitions, see that we obtained our share, pay hotel bills, etc., etc., and generally look after the small financial details, and for some reason which I have never been able to understand, A.G. Spaulding made arrangements with James A. Hart to accompany us as far as San Francisco for that purpose. Though the latter had no special qualification for the work in hand, in fact, up to that time, Mr. Hart, who had been connected as manager with Louisville, Boston, and Milwaukee clubs, had been an accredited failure, just as he has been since in Chicago, where the club under his management has steadily gone from bad to worse, such a thing as a dividend never having been heard of since he took the reins. For his services on the trip he was paid a salary and his expenses, but this was seemingly not enough, for prior to our departure to Australia, Mr. Spaulding came to me with a subscription paper stating that he was securing subscriptions from the members of our party for the purpose of presenting Mr. Hart with a pair of valuable diamond cuff buttons. Just why Mr. Hart should be made the recipient of a valuable gift under such circumstances was more than I could fathom, and naturally protested. My protest grew unheeded, however, and from this little acorn grew the oak of a disagreement between James A. Hart and myself, an oak that has now grown to mammoth proportions. It was while on the same trip around the world that my long-term contract made with Mr. Hurlbut expired, and that I signed a new one under somewhat peculiar circumstances. Returning home, and while in mid-ocean, I was requested by Mr. Spaulding, who was president of the Chicago Ball Club, to sign a contract, which was made for 10 years at my request, with the club as manager and captain, and by the terms of this contract it was stipulated that I would receive a certain salary and a contingent fee, amounting to 10% of the net profits of the club, as shown by the books of that organization, which in 1890 amounted to little or nothing, owing to the troubles engendered by the Brotherhood Revolt and the war between the National League and the American Association, though during a portion of the time I was paid something in excess of my salary, presumably on the supposition that the labourer was worthy of his hire. In 1891, greatly to my astonishment, Mr. Spaulding retired from the presidency, and James A. Hart was elected to the vacant position. At that time I received a long letter from Mr. Spaulding, in which he took particular pains to assure me that Mr. Hart was a mere figurehead, who would always be subject to his advice and control, and just so long as he, Mr. Spaulding, was connected with the club, I should be retained by the organization. In the face of such an assurance as that, and in view of the fact that I had been associated so many years with Mr. Spaulding, in business, having first come to Chicago at his solicitation, I could see no reason for doubting his word, though subsequent events have shown me differently. While in Philadelphia, after the recent league meeting held in New York, I called on John I. Rogers in reference to securing a contract to manufacture the league ball, and in the course of our conversation the subject of my treatment by the Chicago management came up. He then informed me that while presiding at a banquet given by the Philadelphia Club some 2 years ago, and at which both Mr. Hart and myself were guests, he had informed Hart that he was going to call on me for a speech. To this Hart had replied that he and I were not on the best of terms, then went on to tell him that when he, Hart, had joined the Chicago Club, Spaulding had agreed to release me at the end of my contract and place him, Hart, at the head of the Chicago Club. If Mr. Hart told the truth when he made that statement, then Mr. Spaulding certainly deceived me, but that is a matter of veracity for them to settle between themselves. In 1893, the Chicago Ball Club was reorganized under the name of the Chicago League Ball Club, and by the terms of an agreement made with Mr. Spaulding, I was allowed to take a certain number of shares of the stock, in addition to those which I held in the old organization, to be paid for out of my contingent fee, which, by the terms of our agreement, it was guaranteed should be large enough to pay for the same, which came to me under these conditions. At the same time, having 6 years more to serve under the terms of the old contract, I was given a new one, which I signed without reading, which was only for 5 years instead of 6, a discrepancy I did not discover until I came to read it over at home that same evening to Mrs. Anson. Then, having still the most implicit confidence in Mr. Spaulding, I said nothing about it, relying on his promise to protect my interests. In the meantime, the grounds now used by the club on the west side had been purchased, and I presume a payment had been made on them, and I was informed by Mr. Spaulding that I might either swing the deal myself, or else sign away my interest, which amounted to a little over an eighth, but that in case I took the latter course, the club would pay dividends instead of putting the money into real estate. It seemed a little strange to me that I should be asked to swing a deal that A.G. Spaulding and John R. Walsh were unable to handle, and being unable to do it myself, so I signed away my interest. But alas, those promised dividends are still in the dim and misty distance, and my confidence in A.G. Spaulding has dwindled away to nothing, and not unnaturally, as I shall have no difficulty in proving. After I had been released by the club, Mr. Spaulding still posed as my best friend, and the affection that Damon had for Pythias was not greater than I bore for him. I had not then learned the full nature of his duplicity, nor was it until some time later that it dawned upon me. In the meantime, Mr. Spaulding had set foot on a project to give me a money testimonial, and had called a meeting of the Chicago Athletic Club for the purpose of perfecting the plans for same. This I refused to accept for the reason that I was not a pauper, and the public owed me nothing, and I believed that I was still capable of making my own living. At that meeting, H.A. Pratt, who represented me, read the following letter that I had written for the occasion. To my friends. The kind offer to raise a large public subscription for me, the first notice of which I received by a chance meeting with Mr. Spaulding the afternoon preceding its publication in the daily papers, is an honour and a compliment I duly appreciate. Implying as it does the hearty goodwill and close fellowship of the originator of the movement, A.G. Spaulding causes me to regard it higher. There are times when one hesitates to receive honours even from friends, and at this hour I deem it both unwise and inexpedient to accept the generosity so considerably offered. A.C. Anson. This testimonial, had I accepted it, would doubtless have been a great success, as it was endorsed by all the league magnates, by the press generally, and by the lovers of baseball all over the country. But to me it appeared to be something too much in the nature of a charity gift for me to accept, and I felt that I should stultify my manhood by doing so, and that I should sacrifice that feeling of independence that I had always possessed. To the many friends who urged it upon me at the time I am deeply grateful, but I feel that in declining to accept it I did a wise thing, and I am confident that very many of them now agree with me in that opinion. Just at this stage of my affairs, my plans for the future were apparently a matter of great interest to both press and public, and if the statements made by the former were to be believed, I had more schemes on hand than did a professional promoter, and every one of them with millions in it. I was to manage this club, and manage that club. I was to play here and to play there, and in fact there was scarcely anything that I was not going to do if the reporter's statements could be depended upon. One of the most senseless of these was the starting of the A.C. Anson Baseball College, the prospectus for which was typewritten in the sporting goods store of an A.G. Spaulding, and read as follows. Location. The school will be located in what is known as the A.G. Spaulding Tract, covering the blocks bounded by Lincoln, Roby, 143rd and 144th Streets, upon which Mr. A.G. Spaulding will erect suitable structures, fences, stands, dressing rooms, etc. The site is in the celebrated Calumet region and is of easy access. Membership. All accepted applicants for the membership will be required to submit to a thorough physical examination and go through a regular and systematic course of training calculated to prepare them for actual participation in baseball games. Upon entering, they will be subscribed to the rules and regulations of the institution, which will demand obedience and provide for discipline, abstemious habits, regular hours, proper diet. In fact, everything which tends to improve their health and physical condition will be required. They must also pass an examination made by Captain Anson as to their natural aptitude for becoming proficient in the game of baseball. Instruction. The course of instruction will consist of physical training by the latest and most approved methods, with a special intention of developing the body and mind, so that the best possible results may be obtained, looking into the perfection of baseball playing. Daily instruction will be had in the theory and practice of the game. Engagements. As soon as students are sufficiently developed and display skill to justify, efforts will be made by the college management to secure lucrative engagements for those who desire to enter the professional field. Arrangements will be made with the various professional and semi-professional clubs throughout the country by which students of the college will come into contact with managers and be enabled to make known their merits. Application for admittance. Persons who desire to become students of the college will be required to fill out and sign the regular application blank provided by the college, which must give information regarding the applicant, such as name, place of residence, height, weight, various measurements, past vocation, habits, state of health, etc., etc. Charges. Accepted students will be required to pay a tuition of $2 per week, at least 5 weeks of tuition to be paid in advance, and must supply their practice uniform. The college will provide all team uniforms for use in games and all materials and utensils necessary for practice. Then followed a showing of financial possibilities that would have done credit to the brains of a Colonel Sellers. It is unnecessary for me to say that this scheme never emanated from me, or that it never received any serious consideration at my hands, the real plan being to create a real estate boom and enable Mr. Spaulding to dispose of some of his holdings, using me as a cat's paw with which to pull the chestnuts out of the fire. All this time I was busily engaged in perfecting plans by which I might get possession of the Chicago League Ball Club, in which I already had 130 shares of stock, and finally succeeded in obtaining an option on the same from A.G. Spaulding, a facsimile of which appears elsewhere. Armed with this document, I worked like a Trojan in order to raise the necessary funds, which I certainly should have succeeded in doing had not my plans been thwarted time and again by A.G. Spaulding and his agents, and this in spite of the fact that our probable war with Spain made the raising of money a very difficult matter. More than once when engaged in the task I was informed by friends I was simply wasting my time, as the option that I was possessed of was not worth the paper it was written on, and that there was never any intention on the part of A.G. Spaulding and his confederates to let me get possession of the club. It was not until several men who had promised to aid me backed down squarely that I realized there was an undercurrent at work, and that the option, which it was often denied at that time, that I had been given to me in bad faith, just for the purpose of letting me down easily. But when once convinced that such was really the case, I gave up making any further effort in the matter. Later, I accepted a position as manager of the New York club, being assured that I should have full control of the team, but at the end of the month, finding that there were too many cooks to spoil the broth, I resigned, accepting only a small amount of the salary due to me for actual services, though offered a sum considerably in excess of the same. And this ended my actual connection with the National League Baseball and its mismanagement. In spite of the fact that I had been connected to the Chicago Baseball Club for 22 years as an active player, and for 24 years as a stockholder, I have never attended a meeting of that organization until recently. Then Mr. Hart and myself were the only stockholders present. Again, in spite of the fact that my contingent fees were to be paid on the showing made by the books, these books I have never been allowed to see, nor have I ever been able to get any statement as to my standing with the club, and that in spite of the fact that I have several times made a demand for same. That being the case, how can I be sure that I have had all that was coming to me, or that I have been honestly dealt with by that organization? In all of my club's dealings, I trusted implicitly to Mr. Spaulding, at whose solicitations I had left Philadelphia and come to Chicago. That I made a mistake in so trusting him, I am now confident, as it is a poor plan for a man not to look closely after his own business interests. In regard to my financial dealings with the club, I might be much more explicit, but I feel it is not a matter of great public interest, and I therefore refrain from doing so, believing that what I have already said will serve to show how I stand and how I feel in the matter. End of chapter 33. Chapter 35 of A Ball Player's Career. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Cavaet. A Ball Player's Career by Adrian C. Anson. Chapter 35. How My Winters Were Spent. How do the members of the baseball fraternity spend the winter seasons? If I have been asked that question once, I've been asked it 1,000 times. The public, as a rule, seems to think that because a man is a professional ball player, and therefore employed but 7 months in the year, he must necessarily spend the other 5 in idleness, and there are doubtless some few ball players that spend their winters in that way. But, be it said to the credit of the craft, there are not many of them. There is no man upon whose hands time hangs so heavily as it does upon the hands of him who has nothing to do. At least that has been my experience. And for that reason I have always managed to busy myself at something during the winter months. Some of the things I engaged in proved profitable, others did not, but all in all, the winter of 1885 yielded me the best results of my life, for that winter I spent in doing what the old gentleman had wanted me to do before, viz., going to school. I had a very good reason for doing this, as you can readily see. During my ball-playing career, I had entrusted some money to the old gentleman up in Marshalltown for safe-keeping. While there up on a visit in the fall of 1884, needing some coin, I asked for it. "Figure up how much I owe you, interest and all," was his reply, "and we'll have a settlement." Now, the old gentleman might just as well have set me down at the foot of the Rocky Mountains with a wheelbarrow, and told me to carry them away to the Atlantic coast on that vehicle, as to have asked me to do an example in interest, and I was too ashamed of my ignorance to allow him to know that such a thing was beyond my powers. So I managed to get around the matter in some way, but I made up my mind there and then that I would at the first opportunity learn at best enough to take care of my own business. That winter I spent with my wife and daughter in Philadelphia, and here I found that she had a brother, Remy A. Fiegel, who was as averse to going to school as ever I had been. By this time I had come to a realizing sense of the power of knowledge, and so I laboured with him until he consented to go to night school, providing that I would send him, which I agreed to do. Pierce's Business College was the place selected, and when I went up there to make the necessary arrangements for his tuition, I asked how old a man had to become before he was barred from attending. "Oh," replied the superintendent, "age is no bar here. We have a great many scholars right now who are a long ways older than you are." "All right, you can just put my name down too," I replied, and the following Monday evening Remy and I started to go to school together, and this time there was no nonsense about it. That winter I studied faithfully, and though it was hard work, by the time spring came and we returned to Chicago, I had at least acquired a fair knowledge of the rudiments of business, was able to keep my own books, figure my own interest, and in fact run my own business. During the greater part of another winter I ran a handball court on Michigan Avenue in Chicago, which did not prove to be a paying venture, one reason, and the paramount one, being that it was too far away from the business centre of the town at the time, though now it would have been in the very heart of the business district, while still another was that there were not enough handball players in the city to keep the game running. Sometime during the latter part of the 80s, the old Congress Street grounds were converted during the winter season into a skating rink and toboggan slide, and of this I had the management during one whole season, a season that was pecuniarily profitable to the lessees of the grounds, as the weather during the greater part of the winter was severe, the ice in fine condition, and the toboggan slide in apple pie order. Ice skating was that season more popular in Chicago than it had ever been before, and the toboggan craze, which had been brought over from Canada, at once caught on to the public fancy. As a result, the Congress Street rink was crowded both afternoon and evening, and strange to relate, the attendance was of the most fashionable sort, the young men and maidens from all parts of the city assembling for the purpose of going down the toboggan slide, which was attended with a great deal more excitement in those days than was the sport of shooting the chutes, its summer prototype, which later on became popular. The grounds were handsomely lighted and thronged, as they were in the evening, with gaily attired skaters of both sexes, and toboggan parties arrayed in the picturesque rigs that were in the fashion in Montreal, Quebec, and other Canadian cities. They made a pretty sight, and one that attracted crowds of spectators, some of the skaters being of the kind that would have been styled champions in the days when Frank Swift, Callie Curtis, and others were the leading fancy skaters. The next season the same rink was managed by John Brown, the late secretary of the Chicago Baseball Club, but unfortunately he was not blessed with the Anson luck, and the winter being a mild one and the freezes few and far between, he did not make a success of the venture. The toboggan craze was merely one of the fashionable fads of the moment, and now one rarely hears of anything at all of the sport. As a bottler of ginger beer, I achieved at another time great distinction, and there are some men in the country right now who have a very vivid remembrance of the beverage that I was unfortunate enough to put upon the market. My experience as a ginger beer manufacturer was laughable, to say the least, though I confess I did not appreciate the fact at the time as much as did some of my friends and acquaintances. During several of my visits to Canada in search both of players and pleasure, I had made the acquaintance of a Mr. William Burrell, who at that time conducted a clothing store at London, Canada, and who had treated both myself and Mrs. Anson with great kindness. This gentleman finally went down the toboggan slide in a business way, and at last turned up in Chicago with very little money and a formula for making and bottling ginger beer. He needed, according to his own estimate, about $500 more capital than he possessed, and wished me to join him in manufacturing it. He was a nice fellow. I was anxious to help him along, and besides that, viewed from a business standpoint, it looked like a good thing. And as I was never averse to taking a chance when there was a good thing in sight, I concluded to join him in the venture. The $500 that I originally required to invest grew into $1,500, however, before we got the thing on the market, and then the sales started off in lively fashion, and so, not long afterwards, did the ginger beer. There was a flaw in the formula somewhere. Just what it was I have never been able to ascertain, but, well, there was something the matter with it. It wouldn't stay corked, and that was its worst feature, but would go off at all times of the day and night in the most unexpected fashion. If the cork would hold, the bottle wouldn't, and as a result there would be an explosion that sounded like the discharge of a small cannon. Sometimes only one bottle out of a dozen would explode, and then again the whole dozen would go off with a sound like that made by a whole regiment firing by platoons. It was by long odds the liveliest ginger beer that had ever been placed upon the market. There was entirely too much life in it. That was the trouble. Sitting among a lot of fancy glassware on a back bar, it looked as innocent of evil as a newborn babe, but presto changeo, and a moment afterwards it was its satanic majesty on a rampage, and that back bar with its glassware looked as if it had been struck by a Kansas cyclone. Complaints began to pour into the factory from all kinds and classes of customers, and I began to be afraid to walk the streets for fear that someone would accuse me of having bottled dynamite instead of ginger beer. I sold a case of it to a friend of mine who kept a noted sporting resort on South Clark Street, Chicago. It was harmless enough when I sold it to him. It was young then, and its propensity for mischief had not been fully developed. It developed later. One evening, when all was quiet, there was an explosion in the cellar. It sounded like the muffled report of a dynamite cartridge. The billiard players dropped their cues, and some of them started for the door. A second explosion followed, and the coon porter's hair fairly stood on end, and their faces became near as white as chalk as a black man's cow. The proprietor started down the cellar to investigate. He had gotten halfway down when there came a third explosion. He came back up more hastily than he had gone down, and ordered one of the porters to ascertain the cause of the trouble. The porter was a brave man, and he refused to do it. I did not blame him when I heard of it. In the meantime, the rest of the ginger beer bottles had caught the contagion, and the fusillade became fast and furious, and it did not stop until the billiard room and the last bottle of ginger beer were both empty. After silence had reigned for some time, and it had become apparent that danger was all past, my friend the proprietor grew courageous again, and lamp in hand, he visited the cellar to investigate. Where the case of ginger beer had been set, there was a mass of wreckage. Broken glass was everywhere, while the flooring, ceiling, and walls were stained in 100 different places. As he emerged from the cellar, with a look of supreme disgust on his countenance, he was surrounded by an anxious group who asked as one man, "What's the matter down there, Lewis?" "It's that ginger beer of Anson's," was the reply. Then there was another explosion, this time one of laughter. Anson's ginger beer was getting a reputation, but it was not exactly the sort of reputation that I had wanted it to have. I was willing to close out the business even at a sacrifice, and this I did. I saved more in proportion of my money than my customers did of the ginger beer I had sold them. This was one consolation. End of chapter 35. Chapter 36 of A Ball Player's Career. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Cavaet. A Ball Player's Career by Adrian C. Anson. Chapter 36. With the Knights of the Queue. There is no more fascinating game in existence at the present day than billiards, and no game that is more popular with gentlemen, and for the reason that it can be played indoors and in all kinds of weather, and that it does not require the frame of an athlete nor the training of one to play it successfully, though it may be set down as a fact that the experts at billiards are few and far between, for the reason that it takes not only natural ability and constant practice to even be a moderately successful billiardist, the real geniuses at the game being born, not made. Since the days of my early boyhood, billiards has divided my attentions with baseball, and what little skill I have attained at the game is due as much to good habits and constant practice as is the success that I achieved on the ball field. The game itself has undergone many and frequent changes since I first began to play in the old hotel at Marshalltown, and with tools of such a primitive character that they would have been laughed at in a modern billiard resort. The four-ball game and the old-fashioned six-pocket table have both been relegated into the shadows of obscurity, and the new standard 5x10 table, without pockets, that is a model of the builder's art, has taken the place of the one- and three-ball games of various styles, from straight whale to three-cushion caroms over the other. Each and every game that has been played has been an improvement on the style of the game that preceded it, and each and every style of game has had its own special votaries, some players excelling at one style of billiards, some at another. The players who excelled at all being few and far between. It has been my good fortune to enjoy the acquaintance and friendship of nearly all the billiard players who have become famous in the annals of the game since I first began ball playing for a livelihood in Rockford, among them being Frank C. Ives, the young Napoleon of billiards, who, like myself, was a ball player before he ever became known as a knight of the cue, and whose early death was so greatly regretted by every lover of the game, both at home and abroad. Jacob Schaefer, the wizard of the cue, as a ball-to-ball player, ranks at the head of the profession, and who plays any and every game that can be played upon a billiard table with skill that is akin to genius. George F. Slosson, the student, whose persistent application and studious habits have combined to make him one of the greatest players of his day and generation. Eugene Carter, you know me, whose stalwart form and ready tongue are as well known in the majority of the European capitals as in the larger cities of our country. Thomas J. Gallagher, Grey Tom, who is a hard man for any of the second-class experts to tackle. Edward McLaughlin, the little gentleman who first came into prominence at Philadelphia. Frank Maggioli, who has grown grey in the service of billiards, but who still retains his title of Champion of the South. Billy Catton, the Rock Island Wonder. George Sutton, and many others, with the most of whom I have crossed cues either for money or in a friendly way at some time or another. The first expert of any note that I ever met over a billiard table was Eugene Kimball of Rochester, New York, who in 1871 was a member of the Forest City Club of Cleveland, Ohio, and who at that time enjoyed a wide reputation as a billiardist as well as a ball player. Kimball, it has been generally conceded, played a strong game of billiards for those days, and on one occasion when the Cleveland Club visited Rockford, he and I engaged in a game that attracted considerable attention, both on the part of the members of the two teams and of other outside friends and admirers. There were no stakes up, if I remember rightly, and I am not just certain as to how the game resulted, though unless I am very much mistaken, it was in Kimball's favour, but not by such a large margin of points as to make me ashamed of myself. It was while a member of the Athletic Club of Philadelphia that I made my debut as a billiardist in public. I played the game a great deal in those days and had acquired quite a reputation for skill in handling the cue among my fellow ball players, nearly all of whom could play the game after some fashion, there being seemingly quite an affinity between baseball and billiards. James Lentz of Trenton, New Jersey, at that time enjoyed quite a reputation as a billiard expert in the land of the sandflies and mosquitoes, and he being in Philadelphia, we came together at Nelm's billiard room in a match game, 300 points up at the old three-ball style of billiards, for a stake of $100 a side, and I beat him by a score of 300 to 252, no account of the averages or high runs being kept for the reason, as I presume, that nobody thought them worth keeping, though enough of the filthy lucre changed hands on the result to keep some of my ball-playing friends in pocket money for some days. That game was played on the 4th day of February 1875, and it was not until more than 10 years afterwards that I again appeared in public as a billiardist. Frank Parker, the ex-champion in the days of the old four-ball game, now dead, was then a resident of Chicago, and his friends thought so well of his abilities at the 14-inch bulk line game, which up to that time had never been played in public, that they offered to match him against me for stakes of $250 a side, the game to be 500 points up. After some talk back and forth, this match was finally made, and March the 25th, 1885, we came together in Central Music Hall, Chicago, before a fair-sized crowd, and I won by a score of 500 to 366, averaging in the neighbourhood of 5 and astonishing both Parker and his friends. Slosson's billiard room on Monroe Street, Chicago, was at that time, and for several years afterwards, the scene of more brilliant matches than any similar resort in the United States, it being the headquarters of the bookmaking fraternity as well as the billiardists from all sections of the country, and it is more than probable that larger sums of money changed hands over the results of the games that were played there during the winter of 1885 and 1886 than changed hands in any other hall in the country, the leading billiard rooms of Gotham not excepted. Among the billiardists who were making Chicago their headquarters that winter were Jacob Schaefer, George F. Slosson, Eugene Carter, Thomas F. Gallagher, and William H. Catton, while among the bookmakers that made Slosson's room their lounging place were such well-known knights of the chalk and rubber as Dave Pulsifer, who afterwards owned the famous racehorse Tenny, James H. Murphy, whose pacer, Star Pointer, was in after years the first horse in harness to beat the 2-minute mark, William Riley, who, under the sobriquet of Silver Bill, is known from one end of the country to the other, Charlie Stiles, for years the trusted lieutenant of Bride and Armstrong, the Grand Circuit pool sellers, George Wheelock, then hailing from New St. Louis, but now known as one of the nerviest of New York's betting brigade, Joe Ullman, who then, as now, was a plunger, Johnny O'Neill, Frank Eckert, and many others, the place also being a favourite resort for the horsemen. Thomas J. Gallagher was that fall in good form, and there were several members of the bookmaking fraternity who stood ready to back him whenever he said the word. I had taken a notion into my head that I could beat him, nor was I alone in the opinion, for my friend, Bart White, thought the same way. The result was that I agreed to play him a match 300 points up at the 14-inch bulk line game for stakes of $100 a side. We came together on the afternoon of November the 23rd at Slosson's room, and Gallagher won by 17 points, after a close and exciting contest, the game standing at 300 to 283 in his favour. Neither my friends nor myself were satisfied with the result of this game, during the progress of which I had met with some hard luck, and which I was certain I might have played better, and as a result we at once made another match at the same game to be played that night, the stakes this time to be increased to $150 a side. The game was played in the presence of quite a crowd of billiard enthusiasts, and again Gallagher won by 309 to 280, but even this defeat did not convince me that he was a better player, and the result was still another match of 400 points up at the same game for stakes of $100 a side. This was played the following evening, and for the third time Gallagher carried off the honours, the total showing 400 points for him as against only 183 for myself, and by this time I had come to the conclusion that he was a little bit too speedy for me, and that he could look for somebody else to pay his board bills. That same fall, Wyman McCleary of St. Louis, then as now recognized as one of the strongest amateur players in the country, dropped into Slosson's room, and the result was that I played him 2 matches at the 14-inch bulk line game, each one being for $50 a side, winning both. The score in the first one being 300 to 164, and in the second 300 to 194. My average for last being 14 to 17, a performance that was, at that time, something better than the ordinary, even as far back as those days when there was a craze for angle games, and at 3 cushions Eugene Carter was especially strong, he having a standing challenge to play any man in the world at that style of billiards. He finally offered to play me 50 points, his backer to wager $300 to 100, that he could beat me, and this offer I accepted. The story of that game, as told in verse by a Chicago newspaperman under the title of A Match at Slosson's Room, was as follows. It was some time in the winter, and if I remember right, there were snowflakes softly falling through the darkness of the night, when I wandered into Slosson's, where the lights were all ablaze, in the hopes of seeing billiards, for I had had the billiard craze. Round the table there had gathered all the sporting men in town, putting money up in handfuls each was anxious to take down. Some would yell, "I'll take Anson at the odds of 3 to 1, and another cry, "I've got you," and the betting had begun. 'Twas a match game at 3 cushions, 50 points up for a stake. Between the baseball man and Carter, it wasn't an even break, for the odds were all in money and the playing even up, but the horse that packs the top weight does not always win the cup. Odds in money cut no figures from a betting point of view, as I've found in life quite often, and I doubt not so have you. If a man can't win at evens, then he cannot win at all, be the odds they bet against him very large or very small. Carter had the style and finish, but the captain had the nerve. That in baseball oft has helped him solve a pitcher's meanest curve. And he seemed to know the angles just as well as you know me. That he wasn't a beginner was as plain could be. Round the table stood the betters, looking on with eager eyes, while first one and then another certain seemed to take the prize. On the wire the clustered buttons sat like sparrows in a row, 'neath the lights that gleamed and glistened while their outside fell the snow. Carter stood about and chattered just as Carter always will. If you have a talking parrot, you can never keep him still. Anson only laughed and listened, saying as he chalked his cue, "Frog's legs measured up in inches don't tell what a frog can do." When it comes to jumping, Carter and the best fish in the brook finds at last he's met his master when he grabs the angler's hook. Talking does not win at billiards, nor at any other game. When you come to count your buttons, then perhaps you'll think the same. When the buttons up together, one by one upon the string, like two yachts that skim the waters, they were racing wing to wing. Hushed was all the noisy clamour, and the room was as still as death, as they stood and watched the players chalk their cues with bated breath. "Even up," the marker shouted, and the buttons on the line, counted up, stood right together. Each had stopped at 49. It was Anson's shot, a hard one, that the balls before him lay, and he stopped to count the chances, then he chalked his cue to play. "Call it off, I'll give you 50, said George Wheelock, sitting near. He had found the stakes for Carter, and his voice was low and clear. "Take your stakes down, Captain Anson, and take 50 plunks of mine." With a nod the cap consented. Carter's backers brought the wine. In that billiard room of Slosson's, Carter argued half the night, while the snowflakes drifted earthward like a mantle soft and white. And he swore that he'd have won if it wasn't for a miss, that he'd made up in the corner where he'd played to get a kiss. Now it may be that he would have, but I'm still inclined to believe that he weakened all the billiards that he found up Anson's sleeve. For I've noticed that the sucker, or the chap you're thinking one, proves the shark that gets the money doing stead of being done. The only match that I have engaged in since those days was one that I played last fall with Conklin, a West Side amateur in Chicago, and was at the 18-inch bulk line game, 14 points up for stakes of $50 a side, 200 points to be played in my own room and 200 in Clark's resort. The first night in my own room I obtained such a good lead as to make the result look like a foregone conclusion, but the next night he came back at me like a cyclone, averaging over 7, a rattling good performance of that style of billiards. He beat me out and did it in such a handsome manner as to challenge my admiration and respect. Since then he has beaten Morningstar, a Boston, Massachusetts professional, in the same easy fashion, and it would not be surprising were he yet to make his mark in the billiard line. I may say right here that I intend to devote more time to billiards in the future than I have done in the past, that I am always willing to match, provided that the game is a fair one, in which I have an even chance, as, unlike some players that I could name, I am not always looking for the best of it. End of chapter 36. Chapter 37 of a Ball Player's Career. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Cavaet. A Ball Player's Career by Adrian C. Anson. Chapter 37. Dead, but not sleeping. The proposed new American Baseball Association, of which so much was heard during the fall and winter months of 1899 and 1900, is not dead, as some people fondly hope, but only sleeping. That the National League fears the birth of a new rival has been time and again shown, and in my judgment, without good and sufficient reason, for I hold that competition is the life of trade, and that with a strong and healthy competitor in the field, the rivalry would be of benefit to both organizations. From personal experience I know that the national game was never in as a healthier condition when the league had the old American Association for a rival, and when such a thing as syndicate baseball was unheard of. The Harts, the Friedmans, and the Robinsons were not then in control, and the rule or ruin policy that now prevails had at that time not even been thought of. Baseball, as at present, conducted as a giant monopoly intolerant of opposition, and run on a grab all that there is in sight policy that is alienating its friends and disgusting the very public that so long and cheerfully given to it the support that it has withheld from other forms of amusement. It was Abraham Lincoln, I believe, who once remarked that you can fool some of the people all of the time, but you cannot fool all the people all the time. Yet it is this latter feat that the League magnates are at present time trying to perform. That the new association did not take the field in 1900 was due to an unfortunate combination of circumstances, but that it will do so another season I firmly believe, as many of the men interested in its formation are still enthusiastic over the project and determined to carry it to a successful conclusion. St. Louis may justly be regarded as the birthplace of the newcomer, as it was there that the idea of a new rival to the worn-out old league first originated in the brain of Al Spink, who, like the majority of the game's best friends the country over, had grown sick of syndicate methods and believed that the time had come when a new association run on strictly business principles would secure the patronage of the people. Associating with him Chris Van den Eyre, who had become famous as Der Boss of the old St. Louis Browns, George Schaefer and others, he at once began pulling wires looking toward the formation of an organization based on the old American Association lines, one that should do away with many of the evils that now exist. Milwaukee and Detroit capitalists were soon interested in the scheme, and early in October 1899 an informal meeting was held in Chicago, at which Charles Havanna, Harry D. Quinn, Alderman O'Brien of Milwaukee, Chris Van den Eyre, George Schaefer and Al Spink of St. Louis, and Frank Hoff of Philadelphia were present. This meeting I attended by invitation in company with Walter H. Clough, my son-in-law, and after talking the prospects over I finally agreed to place a team in Chicago to represent the new association, provided that a proper circuit of 8 cities could be secured. I was then, as I am now, in favour of invading the cities already occupied by the National League clubs, and leaving the other cities to be occupied by the minor leagues. At this meeting Harry D. Quinn was elected temporary president, and Frank Hoff temporary secretary. Quinn proved to be a hustler of the first class, and spent both time and money in interesting the capitalists of other cities in the proposed deal. In November matters had progressed so far that a second meeting was held in New York, which was attended by the St. Louis and Milwaukee delegations and by Secretary Hoff of Philadelphia, Thomas Navin of Detroit, and representatives from Boston and Providence. Owing to family troubles, I was unable to be present, and but little was accomplished. An effort was made, however, to interest Tom O'Rourke and Dry Dollar Sullivan in the scheme, and this might have been successful had it been known that Richard Croker, the Tammany chieftain, was a great friend of President Friedman of the New York League Club, and might be tempted to cut streets through any grounds that were secured. McGraw of Baltimore was also on hand, looking over the ground, but he was then still confident that Baltimore would be retained in the league, and therefore was unwilling to cast his fortunes with the new venture. Quinn was nothing daunted, however, and continued to work like a beaver. Hoff's promised backing in Philadelphia failed to materialize, and F. A. Richter of the Philadelphia Sporting Life claimed to be able to find both the men and money necessary to put a club in the Quaker City. A lawyer by the name of Elliot and some friends of his were first mentioned as the club's backers, but they failed to come to time, and then Mr. Richter trotted out a son-in-law of John Wanamaker, but he failed to materialize with his money. This was the situation at the time that the third meeting was called by Mr. Quinn at Philadelphia, and which was held there just before the holidays. In the meantime, I had attended a meeting of the National League in New York, and had gone from there to Baltimore. While in the latter city I had a long talk with McGraw, and all but convinced him that Baltimore was certain to be dropped by the League, and that it would be to his best interests to join hands with us in the formation of the new association. Acting on the information I had given him, McGraw and his friends at once secured a lease on the National League ball grounds over the head of the League people, and then came on to attend the Philadelphia meeting. Here it was announced that Thomas McCarthy had things fixed all right in Boston, and that Providence would leave the Eastern League and join with us. McGraw had now become an enthusiast, so far as the new scheme was concerned, but while the way to mend matters looked rosy on the surface, I fancied there were breakers ahead. I was disappointed in the showing made by Philadelphia at the meeting, and had even then grave doubts as to the genuineness of the backing promised there, though Richter, who was even at that time pulling wires in order to be elected secretary and treasurer when the final organization was made, asserted positively that he had found the necessary capitalists in the persons of George Rieger and a theatrical man by the name of Gilmore. The circuit, so far as made up at that time, looked like Detroit, Chicago, St. Louis, and Milwaukee in the west, Boston, Baltimore, Philadelphia, and some city yet to be determined upon in the east. As the days went on, Quinn became more and more confident regarding Philadelphia, and a strong effort was made to get Washington into line, but without success, as the Washington people were certain at that time that the league would consist of 10 clubs and that the senators would be retained. Louisville, in the meantime, was clamouring for admission, while Providence had determined to stick to the Eastern League. A meeting to effect a permanent organisation was then called. This was to be held at the Great Northern Hotel in Chicago on February the 12th, 1899. But as several of the delegates expected had failed to put in an appearance, an adjournment to the following day was decided upon. When this meeting was called to order by temporary President Quinn, there were present Hecker, Harlan, and Spink of St. Louis, Quinn, Havner, and O'Brien of Milwaukee, McGraw and Peterson of Baltimore, Rieger and Richter of Philadelphia, and myself, representing Chicago. Tommy McCarthy of Boston was said to be somewhere on the road, though Quinn held his proxy, and Colonel Whiteside of Louisville was on hand to represent the Falls City in case it should be taken into the fold. Numerous telegrams failed to locate Navin of Detroit, and as the Louisville people proved that they had the necessary backing, it was finally decided to take them in. Detroit's assurance that everything was lovely there came too late, Navin not returning home until after the meeting was over, while McCarthy of Boston did not materialize until after the meeting had been adjourned. A permanent organization was finally effected, and officers elected as follows: President A.C. Anson, Chicago; Secretary-Treasurer Phil Peterson, Baltimore; Directors C.S. Havner, Milwaukee; George D. Schaefer, St. Louis; W.J. Gilmore, Philadelphia, it being left for Boston to name a member of the board at a later date. Richter had come to the meeting firmly convinced that the office of Secretary-Treasurer was to be his for the asking, and he was decidedly put out when turned down, and was disposed to be decidedly ugly. That he had not gotten over it for some time afterwards was shown by the attitude of his paper, which indulged in indiscriminate abuse of every one who failed to agree with him. After the adoption of a constitution and bylaws, the meeting finally adjourned, though not until McGraw and Peterson had been appointed a committee to look into the standing of Philadelphia and to select an 8th city in the East, the 7 cities making up the circuit at that time being Chicago, St. Louis, Milwaukee, and Louisville in the West, Boston, Baltimore, and Philadelphia in the East. It was also decided to open the playing season on April the 16th, the matter of arranging a schedule being left in my hands. The Philadelphia end of it had a decidedly fishy look to me, even then, and McGraw was by no means as enthusiastic as he had appeared at Philadelphia. McCarthy's failure to appear cast a damper over the crowd, and in spite of all that had been accomplished, I had grave doubts as to the successful launching of the project. McGraw and Peterson stopped at Philadelphia on their way home and had an interview with W.J. Gilmore that was evidently satisfactory, as the former wired me that Philadelphia was for Flushing, and that everything was off. After which he fixed up differences with the league people in Baltimore and prepared to play with the club there another season. The dropping of Baltimore from the list of league cities, just as I had prophesied, followed, after which came the sale of McGraw and the others to the St. Louis club, the terms of which McGraw has refused to ratify, the result being that the snappy little Baltimorean will in all probability not be seen on the ball field in a league uniform. The calling off of the deal was a great disappointment to me at that time, and yet, as things have turned out, I am satisfied that everything happened for the best after all. The recent ironclad agreement entered into between the American League and the National League magnates, by the terms of which a team from the first-named organization is to be placed in Chicago, smacks too strongly of syndicate methods to become popular. In a recent letter from Baltimore, McGraw and Peterson both strongly urged the necessity of going on with the new association and getting in readiness to place strong teams in the field at the beginning of the season of 1901. And this is likely to be done. That the time is right for such a movement I am confident, as I am also that plenty of good ball players could be found to join its ranks. The methods of the league in late years have not been calculated to make friends either among the ranks of players or the public, and both would gladly welcome a rival in the field. It would, however, be a mistake, I think, to start with anything but a strong circuit, or to antagonize any of the minor leagues, with whom nothing could be gained by rivalry. If I could have my way in the matter, I would place a strong team in every single one of the league cities, taking in Chicago, St. Louis, Cincinnati, Pittsburgh in the west, and New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and Baltimore in the east. Such a circuit would, in my estimation, be a paying one from the start, and that is the circuit that I hope to see formed in the future. There is one thing certain, and that is a rival to the National League will spring up sooner or later, and that without any help from Mr. Richter. End of chapter 37. Chapter 38 of A Ball Player's Career. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Cavaet. A Ball Player's Career by Adrian C. Anson. Chapter 38. L'Envoi. With my retirement from the Chicago Club in 1897, my active connection with the game may be said to have ceased, and it is more than probable that I shall never again don a uniform. My affection for the game still exists, however, and I am confident that, purged of many of the evils that now exist, the game itself will continue to be in the future what it has been in the past, the national game of the American people. Looking back at my 27 years of active service on the Diamond, I feel that I have but little to regret and much to be proud of, and if I failed at times to come up to the expectations of my friends, it was simply because I was heavily handicapped and unable to carry the load. For the gentlemen who have criticised my actions fairly and honestly, I have naught but the kindest feelings, and for those who did not, and who criticised simply to be in the fashion, or because they were advised to do so by those in authority over them, I have, but perhaps it is well to let the dead past bury its dead. The League Guide of 1898 contains an article on my retirement from the pen of the veteran Henry Chadwick, and I am particularly proud of, and a portion of which I shall quote as follows. Professional baseball history records the development of many an original character in the ranks alike of its press writers, its club magnates, and its most noteworthy players, but it can safely be said that its most unique figure can be found in the League's greatest representative on the field, Adrian Constantine Anson, who today stands forth as one of the sturdy, fearless, and honest exemplars of professional baseball known to the game. The bright particular attribute of Anson is his sterling integrity, combined with his thorough independence. The former was strikingly illustrated at the very outset of his career as a member of the Chicago Club in 1876, when he kept true to his agreement with the club, though under the baseball law as it then existed, the club could not enforce its contract. And his independence was plainly exhibited in the act of his refusing this year to accept a money testimonial at the hands of his baseball friends, he preferring to depend upon his existing physical powers for his maintenance, rather than upon those that offered financial aid. In some respects, Anson resembles a rough diamond, his brusque manner and impulsive temper needing the keen polish of the refining wheel, of the conventional amenities of life to make his inherent worth shine forth in its full brilliancy. Anson, too, reminds one somewhat of the old Western pioneer, Davy Crockett, insomuch as his practical motto is, "When you know you're right, go ahead." This latter trait was conspicuously shown in the year of the Players' Revolt in 1890, when, almost alone as a minority man, he stood by the National League at its greatest hour of need, in opposition to the desertion of hundreds of his confederates in the League ranks. In these prominent characteristics we say Anson stands as the most unique player known in the annals of the professional fraternity. This indeed praise from Sir Hubert, and I raise my hat in recognition. What I may conclude to do in the future it is hard to say, and if I return again to my first love, baseball, it will not be as a player, but wherever I may be or whatever I may do, I shall strive to merit the approval and goodwill of my friends. God bless them. The end. Amos Rushi's pitching. Amos Rushi, who for several years has probably come nearer being the premier pitcher of the country than any other man, gives some ideas of pitching to the New York Evening Journal. He says, "In delivering a straight, swift ball, when my object is to obtain the utmost speed at my command and to cut the plate, so that the umpire can have no doubt as it being over, I grasp the ball firmly with the first two fingers, with the thumb not clutching the ball too tightly. It is not my intention to twist or curve the ball at these times, but to catch the batter napping or else to prevent him from walking to first. I take one long preliminary swing to prepare the shoulder muscles for the coming strain, and with my right foot firmly braced on the slab, I lurch forward with a high, straight throw, the weight of my body adding impetus to the ball. A slow ball, when mixed up with great speed, is most effective if the change of pace is so disguised as to fool the batter. It does not do to telegraph your intentions of the ball will go soaring over the bleachers, from off the old wagon tongue. Exactly the same preliminary motions should be gone through as if you were to send in your swiftest ball. For this delivery I hold the ball loosely in my hand, holding it with my thumb and little finger. The ball will sometimes almost seem to hang in the air, and the batter, who is looking for a singing, swift one, makes a vicious swipe before the ball ever gets to him. The change of pace is used mostly when a batter has two strikes, and is worked up to the anxious pitch. Nothing pleases a pitcher more than to fool a batter with his slows. To give an out curve to the ball, I take the same grip with the first two fingers as for the straight ball. This thumb, however, with which the twist which causes the ball to curve is given, is brought up in touch with the ball with a tight grip. Then with a long, slow preliminary swing, I give a slight side motion to my hand with a decided snap to the wrist, just at the instant the ball leaves my hand. I endeavour, of course, to hide my right hand as much as possible from the batter, and go through exactly the same motions as for a straight ball. I can get just as much speed with my curve as my straight, which in consequence has proved my most successful ball. The drop ball is the most effective one if the pitcher can get control of it. If the ball falls even half an inch from the expected line, the batter is liable to strike over it. In pitching this ball, I take a tight hold with the thumb and two forefingers, with the third finger underneath in touch with the sphere. Then, with a very high swing and a raise of my toes, I bring the arm down swiftly. The reverse twist is given with the third finger. A great deal of practice is required to acquire control of this puzzling ball, and at times speed is sacrificed in its use. Appendix. Some newspaper comments. With the retirement of Captain Anson, baseball loses its most dignified and courageous figure. A man who has striven through a number of years to preserve the national game in all its best phases, and a man who has fought for decency and gentlemanly conduct on the field, and by whose efforts the club of which he has been typical for a long time has come to be known as one of the most dignified organisations on the National League diamond. His retirement from the leadership of the Colts is received with regret by the devotees of the national game, although opinion is divided as to its advisability. It has long been believed by certain patrons of the game that a change in management and captaincy of the team was advisable, and that a younger man might make the nine more successful. But whether they are of this opinion or not, the patrons of the game this year will miss the presence of the big first baseman, who has come to be typical of the Chicago team. Captain Anson retires with a record of which he may be proud. He has been a prominent figure in hundreds of games, in all of which he has done excellent work. As the head of the Chicago club, he has piloted the three team through good and bad fortune. During the last few seasons, he has not done as well as had been expected at the outset of the seasons. Internal dissension crept into the ranks of the Colts, and the men did not work together. This fact started a sentiment in favour of a change of management. There were disturbing elements which militated against the success of the team, and it was believed by many admirers of the game that a new leader might be able to reconcile the warring factions and get more substantial results out of the aggregation. This was urged as a reason for the retirement of Anson. He had served a longer term than any other baseball player, and it was believed that he could retire on his record and give way to a younger man, who would be able to secure more harmonious work. In this opinion, there was no desire to belittle the work of Anson, nor cast any discredit on his management. His work has been such as to win the respect of every sportsman, whatever his opinion of the desirability of a change of management. But with individual players of the first class, might not another manager be able to obtain better results, was the argument. He is to be succeeded by a man who worked with him as a fellow member at one time of the Chicago team, a man of experience in baseball affairs, and who, it is believed, will continue the work which the veteran has done for the best interests of the game. Whether or not he will be able to make the club work better together than Anson, and whether he can secure better results from the material he has to work with, remains for the coming season to show. But whatever be the future success of the team, it will owe a debt to Captain Anson, for to him is due the credit of being one of the greatest of baseball generals. He has done great work for the Chicago team, and can now give way to another, resting on the honours which has already won, and which the baseball public gladly concede to him. Chicago Tribune. The former captain manager of the Chicago baseball team has just replied to a proposition to offer him a testimonial, in such terms as to do him infinite honour. Mr. Anson had held this position for many years. He had done the work and discharged the duties of his place faithfully, laboriously, and ably, and he had received for his services a salary which he accepted as sufficient. When it was thought best to depose him and to employ another captain, he gave way without protest. He had done his best. He had been paid. He has nothing to complain of, and no favours to ask. The proposed testimonial was offered, perhaps under the impression that he was needy, or that his feelings were hurt, and the idea seems to have been that in giving him a benefit, they would placate any resentment that he might harbour, and at the same time proclaim their own generosity. Anson, however, declined to be put in the position of a martyr or a supplicant. He replied, "I refuse to accept anything in the shape of a gift. The public owes me nothing.
I am not old, and I am not a pauper. Besides that, I am by no means out of baseball. We think that everyone will applaud Mr. Anson in this attitude. There is no reasonable doubt that the projected benefit would have netted him several thousands of dollars. It is not too much to estimate the result at $10,000. He has long been a favourite with the Chicago boy baseball lovers. He enjoys a high reputation for courage, fairness, honourable methods, and professional ability, but he refused the well-meant offer of the Chicago Athletic Association, and we feel sure that all right-minded men will give him their sympathy and approval. He prefers to occupy the position of one who has served his employers zealously, and received full consideration for his work, who has no complaint to make and no pity to invoke. He is not superannuated, has not been ill-treated, and is quite able to support himself for the future. It is a manly, modest, self-reliant, and self-respecting position, and it raises him infinitely in public estimation. Washington, D.C. Post. Our illustrious fellow townsman, Adrian Constantinius Anson, has given the New York Sun a few reflections concerning the duties of womankind, with a comparative review of the charms of the ladies of Chicago and New York. It is Mr. Anson's deliberate opinion that a woman has a most beautiful sphere of action in this pleasant life, which is likely to be jeopardized by an association with clubs. Mr. Anson thinks that the average woman cannot attend to her regular knitting and to the clubs at the same time, and he facilitates himself that the ladies of his immediate family have been restrained by his influence and his arguments from wasting time in society work that should belong to the needs of the small and sympathetic domestic circle. We congratulate Mr. Anson on the ability he has shown in the presentation of his argument, and we turn with confidence to the discussion of the ladies who have come under his observation. In Chicago, says Mr. Anson, the ladies dress very stunningly, just as well that they do. If I am not mistaken, they are certainly just as fine-looking. I'll admit that the New York men dress a great deal better than those of Chicago. Mr. Anson is right. The Chicago man gives little thought to the morrow, withal he shall be clothed. He has his charms, his graces, his many fine points, but as a fashion plate he is not a success. He is content to know that his wife and his daughters are keeping up the standard of Mr. Anson's expectations, and to feel that in providing them with gorgeous raiment, he is contributing his share of the beautiful, the true, and the good of the world. We have believed for some time that the shopping ladies on the east side of State Street constituted a panorama of feminine loveliness unexcelled, but we are glad to have this opinion corroborated by as eminent an authority as Mr. Anson, who has a critical eye for the feminine toilet, and has been in New York often enough in his professional capacity to exercise a just and accurate judgment. Chicago Post. The announced retirement of Adrian Constantine Anson from the management of the Chicago baseball team marks the end of a career that is without parallel in America. For nearly 30 years, Anson has stood among the foremost representatives of the national game, and for half that time he has been a popular hero, whose name was more familiar on the lips of the people than that of any statesman or soldier of the time. Ever since professional baseball became a feature of American life, he has stood in the front rank of its exponents, and as long as it shall continue to be played, his name will be remembered. He reflected credit upon his calling and helped raise it to a plane which made it creditable to him. A certain measure of true glory cannot be denied to such a man. In all his long publicity, no charge of dishonourable methods, no rumour of the buying and selling that are too common in athletics has ever been laid at his door. He possessed many of the qualities that make leaders of men, and his continued success was due to the same study and application which bring triumph in more highly esteemed fields of activity. Baseball owes him much, the public owes him something, and Chicago owes him more. He is entitled to an honourable discharge. Detroit Tribune. The passing of Adrian C. Anson from the position of manager and captain of the Chicago League Baseball Club is deserving of notice by everybody. While it is not our purpose or custom to comment on athletics in general, we deem it proper to drop a few thoughts concerning this man and his life. For 26 years he has been playing baseball with prominent clubs throughout the country, 22 years of this time having been spent with a club which just disposed of his services. 5 different times he brought his club out at the close of the season as a pennant winner, a record which has not yet been equalled by any manager. Besides being a bright star in the ball-playing constellation, Anson was also an expert at cricket, handball, billiards, and shooting. He has ever been temperate in his habits, And his long period of service in this line proves what a man may do by taking care of himself. No better lesson can be taught the young man of today than the observance of this man's life. After all, it is not a mistake made by the temperance people that they don't teach the physical as well as the moral effects of intemperance. The name Anson means athletics. Honest, honourable, clean, pure athletics. No man has done more to place outdoor sports above reproach than he has. Springfield, Illinois Sun. Captain Anson is going to retire. He has played his last championship game, has piloted his young men through the last season, and has made his final forceful appeal to a league umpire. With the honours of unnumbered years thick upon him, with a fame that will endure till the last league ball is batted over the palisades of time, with fortune far beyond the hope of thousands who have howled his praise, the grand old man will leave the profession January the 1st, 1898, when his contract with the Chicago team shall expire. There comes a sentiment akin to sorrow in the incident. The man has so truly represented the spirit of sport, he has so honestly and industriously devoted his every energy to its requirements, and he has so persistently abstained from those customs that too often discredit men in his line, that the great public which loves baseball will regret his departure. Aside from that, there is a measure of compensation. We know that young blood and new methods may help the Chicago team to that eminence it won in old days. This sentiment is entertained by so many patrons of the game that it may be fair to concede them something. One thing is certain. No man living will more cordially wish success to the old White Stocking Club than will the man who has shared its joys, its woes, and who voluntarily, even now, yields place to a younger man. Chicago into Ocean. A few days ago, Captain Anson, a representative of the typical American game, declined to accept a public testimonial earned by years of hard work, honesty, uprightness, and faithfulness as a player. Mr. A.G. Spaulding guaranteed that the fund would reach $50,000, and from the great flow of telegrams, letters, and offers of contributions that swept down upon the promoter of the testimonial, it seems as though that sum would be exceeded. Anson replied modestly that, while conscious of the high honour conferred in the most unanimous expression of goodwill, he could not accept a moneyed tribute. A few years ago, Dr. W. G. Grace, the champion cricketer of England, retired from the game, a game typical of England. Headed by the Prince of Wales, a great public subscription was raised, and more than $40,000 was given to the champion. He accepted. The two men occupied the same position towards their games and their countries. The spirit of admiration was unanimous in both countries. Both were athletic heroes. Grace accepted. Anson declined. Chicago Tribune. The firm of Chicago and Anson expired by its own limitation last night. The partners parted on the best of terms. It is now 22 years since they began to do baseball together, and the record made is an honour to the world of athletics. Long ago, while the dew of youth was still in his locks, the junior partner was known as Old Ants. Many as in army circles the preeminence of General Grant won for him the distinction of the Old Man. Anson first gained distinction as the heaviest batter that had ever gone to the plate. Then, for many seasons, he was captain. He marshalled his forces with the skill of a great commander. He lost many a battle royal, but he never threw a game, and alike in victory and defeat, the honour of Chicago was maintained unflecked. May he live long to enjoy the distinction of being the grand old man of the diamond field. Chicago into Ocean. Our ancient friend, Captain Adrian Anson, will find ample scope for his disciplinary talents in dealing with the cherubim whom Mr. Freeman has aggregated into his baseball club. At various times, the Baltimore, the Pittsburgh, and the Clevelands have held the championship for an all-round blackguardism and dirty ball. But now New York, like Eclipse, is first and the rest nowhere. In this connection, it is interesting to recall that early in the season several of Mr. Freeman's young men haughtily refused to sign the Brush Hoodlum agreement upon the ground that they were gentlemen and incapable of using vile language. The brush rule is valid nevertheless, and the patrons of baseball will watch with interest to see whether it will be enforced against the umpire baiters and vulgarians lately led by Mr. Scrappy Joyce. If Anson is given a free hand, he will keep the rowdies in subjection. If he is hampered, we venture to predict that Mr. Freeman will soon be hunting another captain. The old man will not stand sponsor of hoodlums. Chicago Chronicle. "I noticed," said the old-timer, "that a hit was wanted in Louisville yesterday, and that James Ryan, who had quit rather than play with Anson as manager, was at bat. How many, many times the cranks at the Chicago ball grounds have waited and watched for that same hit, and how often, oh, how often, they have been regaled with that same play, a pop-up to the infield. It is time long, long ago that James Ryan was relegated to the bench or the turnstile, for good. Decker is his superior in everything but grumbling." Chicago Journal, New York, April 2nd. A.G. Spaulding absolutely denied today the truth of the published reports that he had jestingly offered the franchise of the Chicago club to Anson for $150,000, and that while Anson was hustling around trying to raise the money, he had no intention whatever of releasing the franchise when it came to a showdown. "The story is absurd," said Mr. Spaulding. "In the first place, Anson is not trying to get the franchise. No one has made overtures to me with that end in view. I have set no price on the franchise because I had not the slightest intention of letting it go." Chicago Chronicle. Temporarily, war rumours must sink into innocuous destitute and other old things. A matter of more far-reaching importance now claims our attention. We shall continue to hope that Sampson and Dewey and Miles will do their whole duty, but we will not be able to give our personal attention to the trifles that occupy them until we've received definite information whether or not Anson is really going with the New Yorks. Chicago Post. As a fielder, many have surpassed him, but as a batsman, and batsmen-like poets are born, not made, and of the kind of players hardest to get, his record has never been excelled. He has not always stood at the head of the list, but has always kept up a steady fusillade. Des Moines Leader. The passing of Anson from the National League removes from the national game its most conspicuous and active spirit. For many years this young old man has been the principal figure in the grandest of outdoor sports, and his setting aside by the managers of the team that he made famous will be lamented everywhere. Detroit Journal. Now it is claimed that Anson hasn't a chance on earth of getting control of the Chicago club, even if he raises that $150,000 option. It is claimed that the price set by Spaulding was one of his little jokes, and Anson took it seriously. People who ought to know say Spaulding and Hart would not part with the Chicago club for $250,000. Cincinnati Enquirer. O.P. Kaler has this to say: "Anson may be getting old, his step less springy, his joints not so supple as of yore, but his eyes and his brains are unimpaired. For all that, he knows more about playing the game than the other men on his team combined. There are at least 7 less valuable players than Anson among the Chicago Colts." New York Herald. Owing to the Delaunay incident and the destruction of the Maine, the retirement of Colonel Anson from baseball generalship is not receiving the general attention its importance deserves. Chicago Herald. The young philanthropist who sent $100 to Leiter, with which to corner the wheat market, would exhibit more general patriotism if he would enclose a few thousands to Captain Anson for the purpose of obtaining the Chicago Baseball Club. Chicago Record. Yesterday was a cold day for baseball. That grand old man, Captain Andrianopoulos, Chicago Anson, was umpired out by Father Time after 22 years' signal service at first base. Chicago Inter-Ocean. When the sporting world finds a better or more manly man than old Ants, it will have to advertise for the best the country affords. He honestly won his honours in a fair field. Chicago Inter-Ocean. There is no reason why Captain Anson, now in the full maturity of his powers, may not have a successful career before him as a trainer of horses. Chicago Tribune. It was worth losing the job for Captain Anson to learn what a royal good fellow he is. Chicago Record. End of chapter 38. End of A Ball Player's Career by Adrian C. Anson.